Well, good morning, councillors, and welcome to the Environment Community Committee meeting of the Toowoomba Regional Council for the month of October. So this meeting is open to the public and also be live streamed. I'd like to thank those that are in the room with us today and acknowledge everyone watching via Council's social media channels. In the absence of CEO Brian Pigeon, who's actually on at the Asia Pacific Cities Summit, so Nick Hauser is his delegate today. So acting CEO Nick, good morning to you. So good morning to everyone else that's with us here today. So I'd like to open the meeting by acknowledging the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse the lands that we do meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, Gayabul and Jarawar peoples, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge, rich traditions and bold ambitions of Australia's first people. So attendance today. Item 2, councillors, is attendance including apologies, leave of absence and declarations of conflict of interest. Noting the leave of absence for Councillor Carol Taylor, so no resolution is required there. And we also have the Mayor joining us via Teams. So Mayor, I will, as we get to each of the sections, call for yourself from a voting point of view and also if you have any questions, but I believe Wendy has line of sight of yourself, so if you indicate there, she'll be able to relay this way that you have a question, but I'll try and lead to you in that direction as we go. So, councillors, we do not have any conflicts, but again, if they do arise throughout the morning, so we can raise them as they come. So councillors, we'll go straight to item number 3, which is on the agenda. So it's the review of 2.68 council controlled tree management policy, currently named 2.68 street and park tree policy. So I'll get Tim Revell and also Sally Egan to come forward here in regards to this one. So good morning.
Good morning, councillors. So we brought the policy, the 2.68 council controlled tree management policy, to you in June 2023. At that time, you asked us to undertake further consultation, particularly with external parties. So we have done that and made some changes to the policy as a result of that. We also took the opportunity to undertake another round of consultation internally across council and have made some changes as a result of that as well. We're asking for your consideration of the results of that consultation and the final version of the policy, and our recommendation is that this latest version of the policy is adopted. And we are here today, Tim in particular, to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally, and also, sorry, I forgot before as well to acknowledge Portfolio Lead Councillor Tim McMahon as well, so apologies, Councillor. Any questions on this one? Councillor O'Hara-Sullivan.
Thank you, and thanks for all, coming back again. What I'm concerned about with this is how it fits into the work of the planning scheme, the work that Carrie and her team are doing. And I don't know that there is that there's sort of complete integration with what work they're doing and this. Can you make a comment on that? I'm not giving you a specific example, I know, which is not good.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes. So with this policy, because it's an overarching one, it literally encompasses a wide variety of different contexts, as opposed to a planning scheme, which is literally just at that time of application, if that makes sense. So that's where the policy is written in a base that it can cover all of the variety of situations that there might be some works around trees, or there's those implications with trees. In terms of the planning scheme review, Parks and Recreation are part of the working groups that are ongoing with the planning scheme. Our particular focus is, in a general sense, is the codes, as well as also looking at reviewing the planning scheme policy for, at the moment, street trees. And our intention that we've carried forward through all of those workshops in the codes and everything else is to integrate the core concepts that are in the policy now into the planning scheme. So that's essentially looking at saying, if we're working around trees, we need to understand the impacts in those trees, and then also have documented evidence of the mitigation measures. So that's where we're linking it to effectively the Australian standards, that 4970, and other standards as needed, which is the basis that's in the policy, as well as that we'll look forward to getting introduced into the codes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess, Tim, what I am concerned about is that there's no mention in here, and as far as I could tell, about things like offsets and things like that. So, I just don't feel like it's, that we're working across portfolios, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, in terms of offsets and the canopy cover, replantings and compensation and things of that nature, our policy links to the 7.22 tree valuation procedure, because essentially the policy can only deal with council-controlled land and trees that are on that land rather than the private space. So the private space will have, potentially through planning schemes or other mechanisms, whereas the policy is quite literally just defined to council-controlled land. So then when it's council-controlled land, it then, in the policy, if there is council-controlled tree removals, it then defaults to that 7.22 valuation procedure. And under that valuation procedure, we then determine if compensation is applicable. So there's guidance around situations where it is, and then where it is applicable, it's not a set number. It's determined on effectively the amenity value of the tree, and then the type of trees that are going back in, and the costs associated with those, to effectively get a dollar for dollar effectively situation. So if a tree values out at say $20,000, we expect $20,000 worth of compensatory plantings if that was approved, if that makes sense.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that hasn't been, where that's going to be, the $20,000 of compensatory plantings, and is that the sort of, is that what we want to do? Is that what we want to have offsets? Like, I just feel like that hasn't kind of all been worked out and fleshed out enough at the moment, and that's the work that Carrie and her team are doing in the planning scheme. That and the other things about the tree root and the zone and establishing all that. It says in the report, it is not clear PSP number 8, the fundamental difference between the TPZ and the SRZ, a feature that we'll be seeking to rectify through the planning scheme review. I just feel like we're sort of, there's a lot that we haven't quite worked out, and to adopt this is probably not going far enough, and it hasn't been fleshed out well enough. Thank you.
I'll take that last one as a comment, Councillor Harris-Sullivan. Councillor Summerfield.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for doing work on this and bringing it back again. I really appreciate it, and I know the last session we had was fairly hard going, and so hopefully we get outcomes this time. But there was mention in there, and I can't remember what page it was now, about if a tree was taken away, there were 3 options, I think, weren't there, that could happen, that the tree of similar value replace it, or some money come to council plus a tree, or money or something, was my vague memory of that when I read it. But that might not be what Councillor Megan's getting at. So I guess it is important that we are in sync with the work that they are doing in the planning scheme. So if I could just go to Board Books page 14, which in the track changes, it's page 2. Under the principles, there were a couple of things I wanted to question. 3.2 says advocate for, develop and implement environmental strategies. So that develop and implement environmental strategies, do we actually have capacity to do that, or are we setting ourselves up to fail if we don't have the, like the staffing, the resources or whatever to do it?
Yeah, these are from the corporate plan. So in the context of urban forestry, It's about managing and protecting and developing our urban forest on an environmental scale. So essentially, the urban forest is part of a wider ecosystem. So it's acknowledging that the environmental roles that may play, particularly in how we design our urban forests and the different techniques and positions that we hold in terms of developing that forest going forward.
Okay, thank you. And sort of sustaining it and growing it more, is that what you're saying? Yeah,
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, very much so.
thank you. So then 3.5, I must admit I didn't understand why that's in there, because it's not really got anything to do with trees. And it's a tree policy. Implement water-sensitive urban design for stormwater harvesting and services management approaches where appropriate.
Yeah, some of the different techniques that we're investigating and looking at trying to incorporate where it's feasible is about that stormwater harvesting from the curbside. So we've or the other techniques that we've trialled is where we've got trees like a camphor replacement where they're literally in the road, very close to a gutter edge. We've used some different techniques there that actually collects the stormwater as it's flowing down the curb and channel. So instead of it literally just going in the stormwater system and gone, we're hoping to harvest that water effectively as a supplementary irrigation methodology.
Sounds fantastic.
It's not suitable for everywhere, but where it's suitable, that's certainly something that we're advocating for, which is why we thought we'd include that in there to sort of stimulate that conversation.
Okay. I'd love for us to be able to have a look at something like that on the ground when it gets implemented, because I think that's innovation and it's saving water. So I'd look forward to seeing that. Thank you. So then on 16, all those changes there on Board Books page 16. My question there was, does council have capacity to deliver these policy changes?
Yes, so these changes are essentially what happens now. So it's formalising processes that happen as effectively like a business as usual. So what happens in terms of if there's a park upgrade or road upgrade or anything, or footpath upgrades and those sorts of things, where there's trees involved, it'll usually get referred to parks, and if we've got capacity, we'll review it, or we'll recommend out that they go external and say, look, I suggest you engage a qualified arborist. And essentially what that's doing is it's ensuring that the tree impacts are identified, addressed and mitigated in accordance with the standards, which effectively just minimises our risk level. So if something was to go wrong, we can say, look, we've done everything we could in accordance with the Australian standards, which says if you're in a TPZ above 10%, then you need to have an arborist sign off and say, yes, this is acceptable. So that happens now. Quite often it might just be a simple email back saying, from myself or one of our other arborists, and says, yes, look, reviewed, no issues. Or it might be a case of you might need to modify your construction methodology. We've had a few footpaths upgrades. There was one in Hill Street there, just down from Laurel Bank there, where we've got some very significant large camphors. So the mechanisms there was we just need an arborist on site, review how they actually lift the bitumen up, how they relay, just to mitigate those, and we just document that process down, which we have been doing, but we haven't had that necessarily in the policy document. That's essentially what we have been doing, and then require that of external parties. So say a development is working on a development site. They're doing works that are going to potentially impact a street tree, for instance. We've been routinely, for quite a number of years, been saying we need an arborist report that demonstrates this tree is retainable, and then how you're actually going to retain it. So it's getting that line of sight between what's been requested externally as well as what we're also doing internally as well, to make sure we've got equal settings.
Thank you. So that will also include, we'll see improvement in ergon shaping of trees, will we?
Yeah, interesting question, that one. We have...
Well, it's in there.
Yes, we have added a piece into that one. There's different heads of power with utility providers. And one thing that we've we started since the June meeting is we meet with Ergon now every 2 months, where we effectively as a council, myself, put forward to council effectively our list of grievances, for want of better words, and then they come back to us and say, we've got these. So it's about working through those issues and developing methods forward. So one of the things, the early conversations that we're having is bundling, where Ergon are looking at bundling, where we would expect and like to see bundling, different succession plantings. We always and are very regularly discussing with Ergon pruning and the clearances and the types of prunings that are being done, because that's certainly something that we as a parks branch will certainly get people contact us about. So it's about working through those to sort of get a base that understanding the hard constraints that Ergon have, but also letting Ergon know that we've also got hard constraints that we have from a community expectation, and finding that way forward.
Thank you. 18, bushland areas. Oh yeah, does council ever consider with this is obviously only our land-owned trees, do we ever consider using animals to reduce the potential bushfire load in those areas, such as goats or cattle or something with an electric wire? Do we ever do anything like that? I mean, goats you'd have trouble with an electric wire, but cattle you...
So it comes up every now and then, and there has been a recent proposal to use goats. And goats have been used elsewhere around Australia for a similar purpose.
Well, they eat anything. That's the good thing about them.
And that is also the problem. So unless we have a really good understanding that some of the environmental values won't be impacted by that grazing, then I'm a bit reluctant to do it. But that's just an extra piece of work that needs to happen before we can, know the true impact of what we might do. So I guess the short answer is we haven't done so, but it doesn't mean that we mightn't, where we know we can do it safely.
Okay, so it'd be good to have broad input on that and broad perspectives to understand whether there is opportunity to do that, because I go past forestry every morning coming in here and it's outrageous what's happening there, and that's not our land. But the bushfire fuel that is under those trees is enormous at the moment, and they won't let cattle in there to graze. State government decision, but we can make our own decision, and if we can reduce our bushfire impacts, well, I think it's something that we should be looking at.
Yeah, it's just a matter of, knowing where you can do it safely and not have an impact on any environmental value that you might be wanting to protect.
I might just ask Nick to add comment to that as well.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, councillors. Councillor Summerfield, we do have some grazing leases over various properties around the place for multiple purposes. One of those benefits being mitigation of grass, particularly against fire hazards. So we do actively implement some of those things in some locations. I think when it comes to our bushland parks, it's about balancing the purpose of those parks and whether grazing impacts the ecological nature of the parks or not. So there some of it's happening, but not widespread at every parcel that we own.
It's more in the bush type stuff, isn't it? And so I guess from the environmental perspective, we've also got to look at how much environmental there is there versus lantana and privet. So if you've got 75% lantana and privet, who's winning, I guess. Thank you. And it could be that it's random, that you identify certain areas that could be taken up and doing that. Thank you for thinking about that. On Board Books, page 20, the very last dot point, in exceptional circumstances not categorised above, the review of all available information, tree removal may be supported by council. Oh, that's right. So in the detail in all of that, there's no mention there on impact of residents' assets, and I think that needs to be included as a consideration as well. And we recently had one where their cars were being damaged by, I think it was lily pillies or something, dropping on their cars and ruining their paintwork. When they parked in front of other people's homes, they got abused. They had notes left on their cars, And so they were left with no alternative. Council said, well, if you want to pay $20,000, there were three. If you want to pay $20,000 per tree, we'll remove them and plant a new one. And I really don't think that's a desirable outcome for anybody. And as it turned out, one of those trees fell over because it gust of wind came along and it was a huge tree. So I think we have to have reasonable thought process when we're doing this, and I just think that impact to residents' assets, whether it be their car out the front or whether it be root system getting into their plumbing within their own yard from an external tree, whether it be leaves and things falling on gutters and actually wrecking the roofs, and we have seen that where really bad droppings, and you'd have to be cleaning it every week for it not to happen. I think we have to be a little bit open-minded on that. So I think impact on residents' assets needs to be considered in this. Happy to have the debate. Well, we
But I
can come back to that one if you like and debate it, or we can do it now.
But I think, understanding it from my reading of that, I think there's probably there's a question in there. Do you have comment in regards to can we or should we? Is there a position around exactly that, around assets of individuals or homes or people in regards to policy?
How to put the milk on, sorry. Yeah, we do have a little bit of wording around that, probably more so in the tree valuation procedure. In terms of infrastructure damage or damage to residents' assets, it's a little bit of a hard one, and that's where we've put that wording in there that in exceptional circumstances not categorised above. So it sort of is a bit of a catch-all for ones that don't necessarily fit anywhere in particular, and it's really about balancing the objectives, because it's a bit of an interesting one as an arborist, is that you effectively get two extremes in the community. You get people that love trees and they will almost chain themselves to trees, and then you get other people that just don't like trees, and it's about trying to balance all of those sort of situations so that we don't losing a lot of trees, and that's sort of where we're trying to get that balanced approach. We also take a lot of our cues from QCAT, the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal, who govern, so say you've got a tree in a private yard and the neighbouring yard or neighbouring property is saying, this tree's impacting my house or etc. They sort of govern those sort of private ones, and they'll also govern to some extent.
Yeah, I'm not talking about those ones. I'm talking about the street trees.
Yeah, they do govern street trees to some extent. They won't if it's a park tree, but they will if it's a street tree. Through QTAT, and through QCAT they then have a set of rules and regulations that govern where they will support a tree removal, and that's effectively where we've got the bulk of them, where essentially the person needs to, I can't remember the exact wording, but it's along the lines of that it's causing unmitigatable harm or inability to use their land. And that's where QCAT generally won't support if it's just leaf drop or those sorts of things. And that's essentially where we've got those dot points where we say, this is the reasons where it's not supported, is essentially coming from those documents through. But we do understand that there are some times where it is literally an exceptional circumstances. So it's not just a little bit of leaf drop or etc. It is actually significant, and it's capturing those and then saying, like, on the balance of all information, this is the way forward. We also have in there as well too that if it's damage to buildings, etc., because quite often people will blame a tree, but it might be something else. So we have in there that we aren't ruling those out, but we would need things like an engineering report to justify and say, look, this is the actual cause for those, and those then become part of that justification process.
Okay, so, and I'm not suggesting, a little bit of leaf fall, I'm talking about really extreme damage is what I'm talking about here. So what I'm saying is, do you feel there's enough in there that provides opportunity for assessment when a resident's assets are being impacted by a street tree that council has put in, not one they've selected or anything like that. Council has come along, put that tree in the front of their yard and has then caused damage to their assets. Do they have opportunity to come back without a response that says, for $20,000 we can take that tree away and then put a new one in? That's what my concern is.
Yes, I feel it does, and that would literally fall into that exceptional circumstances category. So essentially, if they could then provide, the evidence and saying, look, this is the sort of damage this tree is causing, we can then use that as a discussion internally with our manager and say, this is a tree, we've assessed it. It might be arboriculturally sound, so then it comes into a discussion about, this is the sort of level that this tree's causing the damage that it's causing. So it's, as you say, it's not necessarily just a quick, easy fix or a cheap fix. It's actually causing significant damage, and then they've provided that sort of information. We can then take that on board and then view that as an application for a tree removal, and that's where we've put that one in there. So if it doesn't meet any of these up here, there's still that opportunity to lodge all of the relevant information pertaining to an incident.
Okay. So I just wanted to finish off there by saying that people who are having problems with a street tree that's damaging their assets, it doesn't mean they don't like trees. It's just that they don't want that one there. They want one there they want another one there that's not going to damage their asset. I just wanted to make that clear. It's not that they didn't like trees. Thank you. On the next page, third dot point, I wondered if we shouldn't use, for unsupported claims of medical interference, property damage including road, blah, blah, blah. I wondered whether we shouldn't put unreasonable in place of unsupported. Or should it be reasonable?
Yeah, we use the term unsupported essentially to come back to the same one is, so where people are putting in a tree removal application for whatever reason, as part of the form that goes out is justifying statements, or evidence of why they are wanting the tree to come out, and it might be for a variety of different reasons, but in this instance it might be a case of they provide some reports from an engineer, or they provide evidence and says, look, this is causing this much damage, etc., etc. So we've got that, and that's where we've used that term unsupported, because we do get a lot of tasks where people will just phone up and say, look, I want that tree removed. Won't necessarily have a great deal of information. It'll literally just be saying, I don't want that tree, or I want that tree out because of X, Y, Z, without that supporting documentation. So it's just, that's why we sort of put that in there, saying, taking out the word unjustifiable, because that's probably a little bit too rigid, but at least if it's supported, we can then have those internal conversations.
Right. Okay, thank you. I'm done.
So, Bailey, did you want to add to that? Sorry.
Good morning, councillors. Just to support that conversation, that's a valid question. That the word is unsupported, but you want justification why you turn down a claim. You've originally started with the word not support, then you've used unsupported again. I would actually, so the purpose of unjustifiable was a legal basis why you wouldn't support something. I would actually put in front of that unsupported or unreasonable claims. That would just give you the power on the basis of not supporting the claim. So I put unsupported, which means the documents aren't supplied accordingly, and then you need an assessment why you would continue to support or not support. I'd put it there, unsupported or unreasonable.
Thanks, Bailey. So, anything further, Councillor Summerfield? Okay, so just councillors, just to know where we see it, I've got Councillor Shine, Councillor Von Hoff, Councillor Carl, Councillor Farquhar, Councillor McMahon, Councillor McDonald. So, what is it? Councillor Shine.
Thanks. Just briefly, really for the benefit of anyone listening and Councillor O'Hara, Sullivan and myself actually met somebody this morning who does listen to these broadcasts on a regular basis, which is news to me. As I understand, clearly, and for the benefit of people listening, the measures that you're dealing with are council-controlled trees, meaning trees on council land, as I understand it. So it doesn't address the issue of the controversy at Reese Road, at Highfields, where gum trees, etc., were within the proposed subdivision. But does it, would it cover gum trees on the boundary, you know, on what I would term the footpath between the road and the fence line? Would it cover that situation? And on a broader question, are we looking at a tree policy governing trees and private property into the future? Is that in the pipeline?
Yes, so probably to answer that one in two parts. So the first part is, yes, this only covers council-controlled land. So in terms of Reese Road, would it have affected the outcome there? Realistically, no. But it's about documenting the whys. And in terms of boundary trees, these are a little bit of an interesting one, and we've addressed them in our tree valuation procedure in detail. And we've taken the lead from QCAT specifically, because it was, with the Reese Road, there was trees literally sitting on the boundary line. So with a boundary tree, it literally comes down to where did the tree originate. So quite often a tree will germinate and then the tree trunk will swell and grow, of course, and then straddles a boundary. But if it's reasonable to assume that that tree is mostly on private property, so the trunk is mostly on private property, it's probably a private tree, and hence we wouldn't classify it as a council-controlled tree. But again, the converse is true. If most of the trunk is on road reserve, then we would then classify it as a council-controlled tree. So where the policy sort of sits in terms of development is it literally comes down to balancing development with with tree retention and how that works in the public land space. So in terms of Reese Road, there was a lot of other complexities there. So the road needed to be upgraded. There was a lot of stormwater infrastructure and those sorts of things. And on that base, then it meant that given the size of these trees, it simply wouldn't be able to be safely retaining those trees. So without taking a huge slab off of private land, which again, it then comes down to, is that something that would be justifiable? In this instance, probably not, because the land take there would be quite enormous if we were looking at what would be needed to protect these trees. And even then, with a road upgrade, that probably still wouldn't be enough, because we would have damaged too much of the roots on that side. So that makes some sense on that side. In terms of private vegetation, this policy literally just does the public lands, or council-controlled lands, whether that be through property services or parks or whoever. At this stage, that's as far as it would cover. And my understanding is that it would be through a planning scheme or other mechanisms would be in that private space at this stage.
Not your area, not your area.
No.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Shine. Councillor Von Hoff.
Thank you, Chair. Through you. Thanks, Sally. Thanks, Tim. Can you give me an example, please, or the most notable example, after we did the second round of stakeholder engagement? Can you give me the most notable example from both the EAC and then also from the UDIA that isn't reflected in what we see before us today?
So in terms of the feedback through there?
What were they asking for that isn't reflected in what we're considering here?
Yeah, so probably the main one from the UDIA was in our current PSP number 8. It's very quite nebulous in terms of what's allowable within a tree protection zone. So it doesn't actually even refer to a tree protection zone. It refers to literally a precautionary area and a critical root zone. The And then some of the diagrams were quite inaccurate for what would be typical. So one of the main feedback items from their perspective is, can we just literally keep it as stay out of the structural root zone and effectively TPZ is okay? We chose not to go that line, mainly for two reasons. The first reason is the structural root zone literally would just keep a tree upright in the ground, so it just effectively stops the tree falling over at the time. That's why we never want to go into there, but the protection zone is what keeps the tree alive. So that's really the area where we're most critical from an arborist perspective. So structural root zone, it's more, I don't want you to get flattened. Protection zone is what I'm most important and most concerned about from keeping that tree actually alive long term. So that's where we didn't go down that line, and through the planning scheme review and the planning scheme policy reviews, we're incorporating linkage back to Australian Standards 4970, which essentially says if you're working in a tree protection zone, you need to have an arborist look at this. If it's above 10% of that protection zone, which can extend well clear of a canopy, you need to essentially have a very detailed arborist report that says, this is how you're going to mitigate it. From the EAC, we've had a couple of changes there. One of the main ones was the term urban forest. We've taken that wording out. So that was one of the main changes that we've incorporated there, mainly because the EAC raised that, and rightfully so, that the urban forest is possibly more of a defining term in terms of the urban bounds, whereas this policy extends way further than that. So we've incorporated that into there. In terms of areas where the EAC have raised, I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head, I'm sorry, of ones where we haven't incorporated. Some of them from off the top of my head was about, does this cover private trees and will it strengthen tree protection? It's essentially, it really comes down to that balancing act, and that's probably the main one that we haven't incorporated, and we tried to get that balance point between all of the different parties, whether that be the development industry or that be internal council, community expectations, etc., is to try and find a point where we're not totally saying no to all tree removals, but we're saying if a tree does come out, we need to have strong grounds for saying to the community, if the community asks, why has this tree come out? And could the tree have been retained? And we can then have that documented evidence down. So if it is asked, we can say, here's our reasons why that tree was removed. And then if it is removed and it fits under our policy, our procedure for compensation, this is what's going back in.
Okay, thank you. It's an interesting one because we're at this point where, as I understand it, in a fortnight's time, we're going to be asked to endorse the corporate plan, and up until that point, all of our policies are still referring to the existing corporate plan. So it might be the case that within a month, this policy won't reflect as accurately the corporate plan, the principles and policy objectives that are spelt out in that corporate plan. And I think that corporate plan includes a sort of a strengthening, in my opinion, of the desire and intent of this council to be green, environmentally focused, protective of our environment within Toowoomba region. Anyway, that's just a comment. If we get down to the nuts and bolts, and thanks so much for those two pieces of feedback, Tim, because I think also when we go out to consult with UDIA and EAC, there are definitely people on the EAC who spend a lot of time in policy land, but really UDIA, they get down and dirty into policy day in, day out, so they really go into nuts and bolts of the wording of policies. And I think that that's what we are seeing reflected in this that we're being asked to consider. If I take councillors to page 16 of board books, which is page 4 of 15 of the draft policy. There's two points in here that I don't think provide a lot of clarity to the intent of the policy. The first is at the very top of the page, where we say activities or works likely to cause harm to a council-controlled tree should be avoided or redesigned and or managed to ensure the level of harm is mitigated in the first instance or reduced to an acceptable level. And I don't think that that is providing enough direction or clarity, because there's so much wiggle room in that. And I would like to ask for consideration that we say one of two things: either activities or works likely to cause harm to a council-controlled tree should be avoided, full stop, or that we say activities or works likely to cause harm to a council-controlled tree should be avoided to ensure the level of harm is mitigated in the first instance or reduced to an acceptable level. I think that the inclusion of the or redesigned and or managed, it's so open to subjectivity. So, and I understand that there's a degree of pragmatism that's needed here, and there will be instances where things have to be avoided in the first instance or reduced to an acceptable level. That's just basic sort of risk management framework. So I would ask that we go and cut the words or redesigned and or managed. And I don't know how you want to do that. How do you want to do this, Chair? Because once we get down, and I only have one other, so I'm not going, there's not a whole lot, but that is one that I would like us to consider. And then the other one, and it's the same one that I raised the last time this was back with council, it's at the very bottom of this same page, under bonds. And under bonds, we've got council will has been crossed out, and it's again may condition bond payments from developers, formal park users, permitted park users, event organisers and other such parties to ensure the protection of council-controlled trees. And again, as with last time, may doesn't provide officers, in my opinion, with any direction or anything that they can fall back on when an event organiser or a formal park user comes and is making a submission to council. I think that we either do will or won't. And I think that the intent here is that we want those trees to be protected. So wouldn't it then stand to reason that we'd say council will condition bond payments? Because for an officer, what makes you say yes in this instance and no in another? There's no clarity with that.
Yeah, so councillors, just on where I will go with this, so obviously we've still got a list of questions here that I want to work through. Going back, even take a step further back, I've taken notes here. Obviously, Councillor Summerfield mentioned around a potential around a wording change, which is on page 21. So now Councillor Von Hoff's added some other additional ones here. So once I get to the end of sort of the questions, and I was just conferring there with the acting CEO, what will, and if this is where we end up with, obviously there will be, if it is, the recommendation is adopted with, or recommended with, these changes, potentially, if that's what we get to, these amendments to the policy. So
Yep,
I'll
that
come
sounds
back
good.
to that. Yeah,
Okay.
so I've got those two that we will come
Thanks.
back to
Thanks,
open
Chair.
up. So
Unless there's an answer or some clarity
Yeah,
that can
sorry,
be
any-
provided to that question about the bonds, what would determine from an officer's perspective when you do and when you don't condition bond payments?
do you have any answer? Is there any response? Any response to that at this stage?
Sorry. Yeah, it's a little bit of a complex one, bonds, particularly with developers at the moment, because we don't necessarily have a head of power fully. But there's also situations where it may or may not need a bond in terms of park access. So they take bonds for a variety of different reasons, for different components. So we just wanted to keep it unsure at this stage, depending upon how it goes in other areas. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it's because at the moment this one's for tree bonds, but we've got to, at the moment we're taking bonds for park access, which is sort of a bit like a blanket one. So we've got to be careful that we don't do a double up of bonds in those situations. So we're taking a park access bond and then a tree bond for the same situation.
Chair, with your indulgence, because it might mean that we don't have to go back to this later. So that is just set policy that we do issue those park access bonds, is it? Yep.
Yeah, we've strayed over a bit into the park booking space with this conversation, and yes, we do just apply bonds to when people are moving around in parks, and even if it is a developer who wants access to a park to get around, or do things next to a park. So that's all fairly standard practice. I can get some specifics for you from the park bookings people if required, but this is a slightly different matter that we're discussing.
Okay, thank you.
So, Bailey, did you want to add?
Yeah, I just had some comments. Just on that redrafting activities. So my comments about the drafting, that you may leave it ambiguous, because activities or works, that's the first point Councillor Bonhoff raised. You've got to leave the optionality in there, or you're going to leave it ambiguous if you put a full stop at the end of word avoided. So activities or works likely to cause harm to council, I can't see, should be avoided. You can't put a full stop after the word avoided, because that'll make the whole thing ambiguous. You've got to give optionality in drafting. You could change it to say, look, activities or works likely to cause harm to council controlled tree, should follow the following principles. Firstly, A, avoided, comma, or B, the next bit, C, the next thing. Okay, you just can't end it at avoided, because it becomes an ambiguous clause. So you've got to remain the optionality in it for application.
Through you, Chair. Thanks, Bailey. I think where I landed actually was activities or works likely to cause harm to a council-controlled tree should be avoided to ensure the level of harm is mitigated in the first instance or reduced to an acceptable level.
Also, did you have did you want to, because otherwise, as I said, I can hold this until we get to, if we're going to get to a point of where we debate it or question it. So, because
I'm not here for debate, I'm just to give advice. Yeah. Make sure you leave the optionality in, and if that works for councillors, that works for councillors.
So I might park that at that, so if it comes up. So do you have any further questions? Thanks, Councillor Bonhoff. Councillor Carr?
Don't go anywhere, Bailey. I've got a question, probably through you, Chair, to either the officers or Bailey. I want to actually step back up the food chain a bit, up the run. We're talking about an operational policy here. Whilst it's an extremely important one, on face value, I think we've made some progress. It's progressed from street trees and trees in council parks to all council-owned land, which is a positive. However, my question is, do we have opportunity to review this policy inside of the normal rolling timeline for the policies when they come around? Do we have that? Otherwise, I would like to tackle it immediately. But if we have the opportunity, I'm getting a nod from Nick, is that we can review this policy at any time?
We can review it at any time, Councillor.
Yeah, and I'm not being silly, because, Chair, if you permit me, we currently have a green IS, Green Infrastructure Strategy. In my personal view, it needs to become policy, a policy. And that policy needs to inform the planning scheme, it needs to inform this tree policy, and it needs to inform all business of council and the private sector. And unless it's enshrined in policy, we will continue to see problems like PSP 8 appear in the planning scheme, and we get rolled in a P&E court because there's ambiguity around our policy and what head of power, as you've rightly said, where it sits. and what do we actually do, and how much jurisdiction do we have. So I think this is a first step, and that's why I asked the critical question. I'm keen to come back and look at this again and see, and Councillor Rebecca's raised a very good point around the corporate plan and how everything is in sync, because it does make it very, very hard for you officers in this directorate and for planning officers in the assessment role in planning and development, for infrastructure services staff. It makes it horribly uncomfortable because we see how this plays out, not just around development, but around a multitude of activities. Until we are prepared to treat green infrastructure as important as any other built infrastructure, hard infrastructure or anything similar, we will continue to have problems in deciphering this, and will continue to struggle to allot suitable budget allocation for General Manager Nick to go away and do his job properly, because we just expect them to grow without any whole of life appraisal on what it costs to maintain a tree and keep it in a safe condition when we're in critical areas where it bumps up against, you know, urban footprint or it's intertwined. What it costs to replace, what it costs to offset, the lowest form of action, by the way, outside of protect, preserve and mitigate. So until we're prepared to do that, and that's why I am very passionate and I will be very vocal about how we need to move forward in putting this into policy, the green infrastructure policy that helps this policy. So Bailey, I guess I'm flagging there's a body of work that we need to work through as a boardroom, but as structurally as an organisation, how it informs our business and how the public and private sector interface with us is critically important. And until we treat this piece of infrastructure as important as everything else and budget accordingly, we're going to be tinkering around the edges. I know that was a statement, but I had to ask that important question at the beginning. So I'm very, very keen for this to come back as soon as we get to the point where and Councillor Megan raised some really good points around where Carrie's up to in her body of work, and there's considerable body of work happening there. So I'm keen for that. These two bits of policy and formulation to talk together so we can move forward on this. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Carl. I've got Councillor Farquhar.
Thank you, Chair. My questions have already been answered, but I would like to take offline and understand more about our tree policy on private property and new developments. So if I can sit down with the team, and that would be great. Thank you. And also invasive species like lantana.
Thanks, Councillor Farquhar. So we can take that one offline. Councillor McMahon.
Hang on, I thought it was a few more. So, thanks very much, everyone. Look, I think that we have a tree policy talking about trees on council-controlled land, and we've already raised it. That's not the be-all and end-all, and I don't think this policy is designed to be every tree. We're talking council-controlled land here. We have I believe, a policy position that says we're not going to remove your trees, hardly ever. And I think that's justified. I think the community wants that, and I think most people would be happy with that. And when we look at some of those classics, my favourite's Getty Street, when there's these big lovely trees that probably annoy neighbours, but they're beautiful and no one's going to touch them, and it, you know, makes it worth living there. I think the policy position is clear and well articulated, and I think we're right here. My issue was, and Councillor Summerfield raised it, but I might just go from a different path. My original issues when we first put this to council were things and I think you raise it for when it's interfering with your gutters or your whatever, but just the amenity when Ergon gets a chop at it, council bin trucks get a chop at it, and we have these ugly as heck right angled trees, right? Now you've added in there the exceptional circumstances little dot point, and I think that's good. I think that needs to be in there. So we've got a policy position that fairly adequately, I feel, justifies we don't cut down trees, but there is a way, there is at least a policy that the average homeowner who's got this ugly as heck thing in their front yard can go down should they need to. I'm wondering if you think that adequately balances the line of we don't cut down trees, but there are options here. And I support that clause being in there, but is this going to open up a floodgates for my circumstances are exceptional when everyone knows they're not? So I completely want that to be in there. I think it needs to be in there, the exceptional circumstances category. But do you think it's a careful balance that is really hard to do? And do you think that clause adequately does that, to let people when they need to, but not a free-for-all?
I believe so, and probably where that sort of comes into is through the application process. So for all tree removals, the tree isn't structurally defective or dead or anything like that nature. Under local laws, they then have to formally apply, pay a fee. Part of that application process, we have a requirement in the actual form that states you need to provide us with, justifying reasons as to why this tree needs to come out. And it's at that point, we can then flesh out, is this an exceptional circumstances? Understanding that, when a person wants a tree out, they're always going to view this as exceptional circumstances. But from an officer's level, we can then have those internal discussions with our manager. And if it's a really significant tree, it might even go higher. But we can then have those discussions and say, is this really an exceptional circumstances? And then it might need a case of we go back to the applicant with more questions, which has happened in the past. We've sought further information from a person saying, what really is the core root of the problem here, and that sort of things. So that's what we've used that wording in there. So it makes it very difficult, but it hasn't necessarily ruled it out entirely. But we then default that back up with what's in the application process that requires that evidence.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm reading page 19. When a tree is not dead, blah, 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 a formal application for removal is required. So that's what you're talking about. What I'm trying to stop is 30 years ago when we planted these trees under power lines, and now you drive along Hume Street and they go to let the power, and it just kind of, it's a tree, it's doing its job, but it just kind of looks like we didn't think that through too much, right? And then where the old mate in his residential property and he's not allowed to touch it, but everyone's had a hack at it. So would that old mate in the middle of Newtown or wherever have to pay his 20 grand to review it?
Yeah, so two parts on that. What we're finding in some instances from the harsh pruning of ergon, which we've had some pretty strong conversation, for want of better words, with ergon, is regarding the level of pruning that's occurred, is some of those trees have then become structurally defective and unsound. So when they're at that base, we then say, look, we can take it out. The other options or elements that we're currently in negotiations with ergon on is looking at some succession plantings and other techniques there. So we're effectively acknowledging that we've got some of these trees that were planted 30, 40 years ago. They're not appropriate for under power lines. These are probably sites and power lines that ergon aren't going to bundle because they're probably not high pedestrian corridors, but they're still in front of someone's house. So it's in those areas that we're currently investigating options where we can undertake some succession plantings in there. So essentially, we acknowledge, yes, this tree doesn't look great, but we're going to plant another tree nearby that's a much better species. It's not going to have these issues. Once that's established in, say, 5 years' time, we then will come through and say, look, we'll take that tree out. So it essentially is a mechanism we can go to the community and say, we understand your frustration. That tree doesn't look great. From a horticultural perspective, it's not good, but it's not unsound. It's still providing some canopy, which is the other element that we need to sort of also balance. We've got a long-term plan, and that long-term plan is we're looking at succession plantings and those sort of mechanisms to then effectively say to the community, we acknowledge the issue. We're also actively working with Ergon and our own processes to get a much better outcome. It's just going to take us some time to get there.
Yeah, and that's what I suppose the follow-up is. It's all very well to say we can plant you another one, but it sort of comes down to operational budgets and trees and having all of that, and it's never going to be a tomorrow fix, right? It might be within the next few years.
Exactly, it does have those dominoes and flow-on effects. That's where part of our discussions with Ergon is at the moment is discussing with them what level of comfort are they interested in partnering with us to be able to fund this. As I say, they're very early days conversations, so we haven't got anything bedded down or even really nutted out entirely yet. It's more just highlighting that with Ergon, saying, and we've had some positive feedback from Ergon that this might be something that they might be interested in going down the line. So it's certainly a working space.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think that a policy like this, it's a really, really hard gig to say we have our trees, we have our canopy, everyone wants them, coupled with your rights as a landholder and finding that balance. I really feel like this policy does that, where it's at now, and I'm otherwise happy with it. Can I just ask one more question on a completely different level? The bonds thing, so I'm on page 19 again, where we talk about council may accept planning or maintenance bond payments from developers where reasonable and justified grounds is to delay planting of street trees. And I take Councillor Megan's point of how this talks to the development industry, and it probably doesn't yet, but and maybe it shouldn't, because we're talking about council trees and council land, but I'm Exhibit A when they get a new subdivision and the developer goes, street trees, little tube stock, boom, 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 boom. And then when old mate tradies building my house, they're knocked over, and now 5 years later I'm the one without the lovely street tree. Because so I actually think that should be standard practice, that when the developers put the tree in is after all their houses have been built. And I wonder, and I think that rather than making the exception, can we make that the rule?
Yeah, we're still working through the planning scheme on that component.
Right.
Where we've got the may in regards to that is at the moment where a developer can provide us with justifications on why they want to delay plantings, we accept those planting bonds in certain situations. And it might be we've had developers come to us and say, look, I'm just getting, tradies are coming in here trashing all my trees, because what will happen is a developer will go in, they'll plant the trees. There's then a maintenance period. So during that maintenance period, if those trees are damaged, that's the developer's responsibility to maintain and replace. So that's where they were saying it's costing me a fortune. Can we enter into a planting bond? Which we may or may not accept. We have a few different criterias that we sort of look at as where effectively the risk that we look at, because I guess the risk comes is if the developer pays the bond and then says, no, I'm going to walk away, it's then council's responsibility to then take that funds and plant. And sometimes that might be several years down the track, and in which case then the costs, etc., resourcing, a whole heap of other complexities come in. So it really comes down to a risk scenario of whether we do take those bonds or whether we say no, in this instance we're not supportive.
Yeah, thanks for that. No further questions. Thanks for your answer, Tim. No further questions. But I do feel like we've got there to a very hard line to put of no trees versus there's got to be a doorway to do it, and I feel like this adequately does it. So otherwise, happy. Thanks for all your work.
Thanks, Councillor McMahon. Councillor, is there any further questions on this? Yeah, I've checked. He's so he's fine. So okay. Well, with that, so we've reached the end of questions. So no, there is a recommendation there, but we do also have a couple of suggested amendments in the policy. So as I said, so where it would land would be if we reach this point of what the recommendation is there, it would be the recommendation before us with an additional line with amendment, with the following amendments, if that's where it gets to. So, question or?
If I may, I hope I'm not jumping the queue here. I think I would like amendments argued individually.
Yeah, that's where I'm leading. So
May I move the officer recommendation then, so that we can argue potential amendments individually?
So you're happy to move it as is?
Yes.
Well, yep. So I've got a mover of the recommendation as is. Do I have a seconder for the motion? Seconded by Councillor O'Hara Sullivan. So I suppose if that's where the scenario sits with it, I suppose we'd have to, see if we wanted to go to debate, then if we went to debate, if there's people who wanted to make amendments, because it'll have a mover and a seconder of the motion on the books as it sits, correct? See it? Okay, so is there a desire to go into debate? Okay, so we'll go through that process. So Councillor McManus, the mover, do you wish to open the batting?
Chair, happy to, but if someone wanted to propose an amendment, I'm happy for them to do that before we go to debate, or you just want to debate the tree policy. I will happily talk to it. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm happy to move this. I feel like we have a very special thing going on in Toowoomba region, where we have trees. We want trees. We are the Garden City, and our residents expect that. So we have a tree policy that is robust, that is well thought through, and that is done with consultation with industry, with residents, and across various departments in council. We need to provide ourselves that we are very proud of our tree canopy, and we don't just want anyone to come in and cut it down. However, from my work in this portfolio, there is a number of atypical situations that I believe fall through the cracks, and I feel like in the previous tree policy they weren't being catered for. I do feel like now we have a robust and strong tree policy that says on the whole we don't cut down trees. There is, however, clauses added for exceptional circumstances, which requires formal policies to councils, which are not easy to do, but at least the doorway exists. And I'm happy to move this, knowing that in my mind it adequately balances the community's want for a canopy and for tree cover and an individual's right to proper peace and enjoyment of their land. And I think we've found that balance. I think it's hard to do in a policy such as this, but I congratulate the officers on taking the time to do this and do it properly. So thank you, I'm happy to move it.
Thanks, Councillor McMahon. Sort of a speaker against, and obviously just the situation is similar as before, because there's the potential around amendments. So obviously there is the ability through this process for people to move an amendment, and then we would vote on that amendment and so forth. But as we sit at the moment, there's a mover and a seconder for the motion as it sits on the books. So I'll go to a speaker against, Councillor Vonhoff.
Thanks, Chair. My reasons for speaking against this is because I don't think it's very collegial, given that there have been some issues raised by councillors, and as the motion stands, there isn't that opportunity to work through those proposed amendments. So I would actually move an amendment to the recommendation that Council adopt the draft reviewed Council Policy 2.68, Council Controlled Tree Management Policy Attachment 2, with the following amendments, and that will allow us the opportunity to work through the issues that have been raised by colleagues.
Yes, I've got a seconder for that. So there's a mover and a seconder for that amendment. So we now move to that amendment essentially. So we'll need so the detail of what those amendments will be. So I'll go to the mover of the amendment.
Thank you, Chair. So I believe that Wendy was working, thank you, Wendy, and councillors will have the opportunity to, I was just going to say, Wendy's made notes of some of those proposed changes, and now councillors have the opportunity to work through those. So the first is from Councillor Summerfield, and Chair, is there the opportunity to ask Councillor Summerfield to discuss that proposed change?
Yeah. Yeah, we can do that. As I said, because we're on the amendment now. So as I said, and there were two potential moves towards an amendment to the motion. So that's what we're presenting at the moment. So we'll go to Councillor Summerfield, who's first. I'll seek advice from the acting CEO, but my thoughts would be that it's the motion with amendments to the policy. So they are amendments to. But allow the CEO to make a verdict.
Thanks, Chair. I think it does meet the criteria for an amendment, Councillor McMahon. I think that foreshadowed motion would be where there's a completely opposed view to the view that's being put forward. So I think that
I'm happy with that. Thank you, Chair. Without knowing what the amendments are, though, we
yeah. So I think so, and I suppose where we sit with it, I guess, was, and that's probably the point. Not to harbour, it was raised before when there were suggestions made, but you've jumped in with the willingness to move it and with a seconder, so that overruled that. So this is the mechanism then to go back for someone who has raised against it to make these amendments. So that's that's where we sit at the moment. So through Councillor Vonov had the floor, who has passed to Councillor Summerfield. So what we're doing now is looking at potential amendments. So Councillor Summerfield.
I'll pick up the ball now and run with it, sir. So on Board Books, page 21, dot point 3, you'll recall that I questioned the unsupported claims one, and Bailey very kindly offered additional advice, which it should actually read for unsupported and or unjustified claims. Is that correct, Bailey? Unjustified? Is that the word?
Good morning, again, councillors. There's sometimes you have to go back and give advice. I'd rather give it than leave it at the table. Okay, so I've heard today that you sort of want to have this discretionary power to determine, whether you can help or you want to enforce the policy. Okay, so we have a provision that's earlier about the application process. If you could go back to that section for me. I do have to give you this advice, and it'll help you whether you want to add extra wording. Okay. So there's a section regarding in the application. Okay, there it is. Okay, what page is that on? Yeah, if you could just pull that one.
So these are the words we're referring to. So that's up on the screen at the moment.
Page 9 on the
policy. Page 9 of the policy.
And I will take the councillor's feedback. Okay, so you've got a section here that says policy statement, the tree is causing demonstrated significant and justified damage to infrastructure. So that brings in the principle to people's property. Okay, so we say that the tree is causing demonstrated justified damage to infrastructure, unmanageable damage service, and where retention options have been investigated and exhausted. So this may require the submission of an engineering report, etc. So that's the bar we set in that section for damage to third-party property. Then if you look at the words that I suggested, so I will raise the concerns that it's the bar you want to set that says that we don't support, and the advice I gave was unreasonable claims. Okay, so we've sort of got a position. Someone could come to you and say that's reasonable damage, and the word we had was unjustified before. What I'm saying, the bar we're setting is someone could come to you and say, look, you're not supporting my claim for the removal of that tree, and your bar is, I'm saying that's reasonable damage, and we're saying, the only bar we said is unreasonable. It's a very low bar. Even the word unjustified was a lower bar. Unsupported is even lower, that you just haven't got the paperwork in. So there is a bit of contradiction in that, and I don't have the answer today. What I'm saying is that one section you want to achieve the ability, but then if someone came to us and said, look, it's causing damage, it's causing reasonable damage, The only bit that we've got here saying the bar is we won't support you if it's unreasonable. Okay, so that may not be the wording that you want for the application of the intent that you're trying to seek. And I don't have the answer of the bar that you want to set. I'm just letting you know that you do have that. And I gave previous advice because I thought the word unsupported was a lower bar, where you just haven't put your paperwork in and we won't support it. The next bit was I put in and said, look, if it's unreasonable, that's the next level. That's a pretty low bar if you want to hold a line on damage and removal of trees, because someone could come to you and say, well, that's a reasonable request. So there's a bit of contradiction in the application on what you want to achieve. So I don't want to sit here and give you a low bar, that's all, if your intention's to be, and I don't, without sitting down and reviewing that wording, but the word unsupported was a very low bar, saying we won't support you if you haven't got your paperwork in. So
Thanks,
someone
Bailey. Thanks. So if we could have unsupported or unreasonable, because that does strengthen it a bit, claims, but it also allows flexibility for sensibility, which I think is important. We all, you know, what Councillor Tim said earlier about, we all want trees throughout our region. It's the main goal, main focus for council to ensure that that happens. Hence, we endorse the green strategy with great enthusiasm. But you do have to have sense and sensibility in there as well. So I think for unsupported or unreasonable claims of medical interference, property damage, blah, 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 that would be my suggested recommendation in that one. Thanks.
Okay, so we've got that one there. So it's still part of your amendment? Yep.
Thanks, Chair. I'm comfortable with that. And then if we go down, Wendy, you're very helpful. Thank you. So page 16 was the next one of board books, which I believe was page 9, I want to say, of the, sorry, let me get there. Thank you. Page 4 of 15 of the policy. And the wording is activities or works likely to cause harm to a council controlled tree should be avoided to ensure the level of harm is mitigated in the first instance or reduced to an acceptable level, taking on board Bailey's advice that it would be, his advice was that don't end it after should be avoided, because it doesn't provide the adequate flexibility in the policy. But by keeping the words to ensure the level of harm is mitigated in the first instance or reduced to an acceptable level, that's consistent with the triaging of risk. You want to avoid it in the first instance, mitigate, and then reduce to an acceptable level if you can't avoid or mitigate. So that's the second one. I just don't think that or redesigned and or managed provides sufficient clarity to this policy. And then the last one, Chair, with your indulgence, I actually have a question, because when I did raise on that same page about bonds, council will or may condition bond payments from developers, formal park users, permitted park users, event organisers and other such parties. There was a strong reaction from Councillor McMahon and also Councillor Summerfield, so I'd like to understand, because maybe I just am missing something here, I'd like to understand why that would be something that they'd like to see avoid, because if I'm in agreement, then I wouldn't pursue this other amendment.
Okay, well, just where it sits, so it's your amendment that you're moving, and if you've requested
May I ask
I'm
that
happy
question
to.
from my colleagues?
I'm happy for that to proceed.
So the proposal was to say that council will condition bond payments from developers, formal park users, permitted park users and event organisers and other such parties. But that was something that was reacted to from Councillor McMahon and Councillor Summerfield. So can I ask, why was that the case?
I'm happy to respond first, if that's okay. First of all, there was clarification from the officers, which assisted me even further, and that was around the fact that this is a bond payment for trees. It's not for the actual park use. There are some activities out there that have nothing to do with the tree. So it could be that people are using the park for, they might have a gym set up that they have to. They may have a party around a table set up. It could be all sorts of things that have absolutely no impacts on trees. So I just think that we need to consider all the fact that there are many varieties of events that could be quite small with absolutely minimal damage to even the grass, let alone the actual whole of park, including trees. So I think that we need to consider all events that have potential use, and between that and the fact that there is a bond for park use already in place, that this would actually be a specific bond payment for trees. That's why I don't believe it should be will, that it should be may, because there's so much flexibility in the uses in our parks. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McMahon.
Thanks, Councillor Vonov. My original thing regarding the use of bonds was around the one that says, page 19 of board books, council may accept planning or maintenance bond payments from developers where reasonable justified grounds exist to delay planting of street trees. So that was my comment on bonds. Regarding what you're saying here, we have such, it's already been said, I'll say it again, such diversity with park bookings, little ones up to big ones, that I think it would be rather onerous and unfair to use the word will. I'm overly happy with may. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. In that case, Chair, I'm happy to remove that last proposed amendment and retain what's in the policy, that council may condition bond payments. So there's only the two proposed amendments to the policy. The first proposed by Councillor Summerfield, the second proposed by me, otherwise adopted in full as it stands.
Okay, so I'll just confirm, so the mover and second of the amendment are comfortable with what we've come forward. So where we sit now, so that's the amendment. So with a mover and a second to that, so we vote on the amendment. If the amendment gets up, it becomes the motion. So that's yeah. The wheels are going pretty fast in my head, but I'm just trying to keep it all up. But if you wouldn't have jumped the gun with moving a motion, we mightn't do it faster. But you're entitled to do so. Hence why I accepted. So you're fully entitled to do so. So anyway, so councillor, so where we sit, so that's the amendment is before us. So the amendment has been moved by Councillor Vonhoff, has been seconded by Councillor Summerfield. And again, to be very clear, we're voting on the amendment. If the amendment gets up, it becomes the motion. If the amendment goes down, we go back to the original motion, which has been moved and seconded by Councillor McMahon and Councillor O'Hara-Sullivan. Does anyone wish to go into debate? Okay, so the amendment... Look like you're half leaning forward. So the amendment. So I'll put that to the vote. Those in favour of the amendment. Those against. Okay. So that. And sorry, Mayor. Thanks, Wendy.
I've had my hand up there, JJ. I don't know whether you can see that, Councillor O'Shea.
So you're in favour of the amendment.
That's correct.
Okay. So councillors. So. That now becomes so the amendment now becomes the motion. Happy to move. Councillor Carl's happy to second. Does anyone wish to go into debate? I'll put the motion. Those in favour. Councillor McDonald in favour. So that's unanimous. Thanks, councillors. Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Sally, and thanks everyone. It's a very comprehensive.
Chair.
Sorry.
Just a question before we move on to the next item, if I may. Can we keep this in line of sight, this policy, in the context of the work that Carrie's doing with the planning scheme around a range of topics and how this may speak to the planning scheme in the future, and also, more importantly, to the corporate plan? I'm sort of flagging that there's a body of work plus with the green infrastructure strategy, and there's a body of work ahead of us in considering what we do with that and whether we enshrine that in policy. because I think it's going to streamline and make the business of council a lot easier across all portfolios if we keep that in line of sight. I just wanted to flag that, you know.
You know, thanks, Councillor Carl. I'm seeing nods of agreement across the front of the table, so I think that will occur. Councillors, I'm going to suggest we break. So do I have a move to adjourn? Councillor Harris Sullivan, seconded by Councillor McMahon. Those in favour? So we'll adjourn and we will resume the meeting at, let's say, 10:40. Is everyone comfortable with that? So 10:40 we'll resume. All right, well, good morning, councillors. We will resume the Environment Community Committee meeting. So we will move to item number 4 on our agenda, which is the Toowoomba Regional Art Gallery Revitalisation Business Case. So the authors of this report, so Tani Pearce, Manager of Library and Cultural Services, and Hugh Dunn, Manager of Property Services. So I'll hand straight over to Tani.
Thank you, Chair. We will take in as read the TRAG Revitalisation Business Case Report, and it's basically seeking council endorsement for the development of a full business case to assess options, costs and benefits of delivering a revitalised art museum to replace or update the existing Toowoomba Regional Art Gallery.
Questions, Councillor Melissa Taylor?
I'm just happy to move when ready. Thank you.
Councillor Harris Sullivan?
Thank you. I was going to ask whether council ever does like a PPP type thing, and then I see that example that you provided, was it Shepparton? Yeah. But that was like a foundation. So do we, I'm thinking, is there the Heritage Toowoomba Regional Council Library, or, does that happen in local government world?
Through you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Megan. I think the proposal such as a revitalised regional art gallery or art museum, as the case may be, there's probably not many things that we do that really would attract public-private partnerships. I'll get that out. But this is one, and this is probably one of the reasons why we would like to proceed with a business case, and we can look at that investment logic and what's around. And my understanding is that there is some interest from the private community about the possibility of investment, and this business case is the vehicle for us to identify that, and we did include the Shepparton example, as you said.
Thanks, Councillor Harris Sullivan. Councillor McMahon?
Oh, Chair, exactly the same question. I was going to ask how we get ourselves a $7 million contribution from an art museum foundation. But take your points. This is a business case, and we can go from there. If I could perhaps make a comment that I just signed a press release. We are closing the doors of our art gallery in October 22 until early in the new year to fix the last lot, finally, of flooding damage that happened. Was significant, and I suppose today's press release from me that highlights the need for a business case for a new one. So whilst there is some caution with the amount of business cases we're pushing through at the same time, I think this one is a very important first step, and I'd be happy to second it at the appropriate time. No more further, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor McMahon. So you second at the appropriate time. Got Councillor Summerfield?
Thank you, Chair. I think this is a really exciting opportunity for council. Obviously the price thing is given our budgets is a real issue, but there is really great opportunity to do something exciting here. And when I think about the Clive Armitage Centre, which that was partially public funded, I'm pushing for a PPP for a MRF in our waste area. I think we've got to do more of this sort of thing because it's such a burden on council to be delivering all these sorts of projects, and I just think it's exciting. We could actually have something really good, and it would support the other galleries that we've got, not only council galleries, but the other, art galleries that are around Toowoomba. There's 2 at least that come to my mind. There's probably more. But having something dynamic, it means you can set up a nice trail. We have got the most amazing artwork over there. It's quite gobsmacking. It's total value. I don't know whether we ever get valuations of our artwork. We do. I'm getting a big nod there. But it would be significant. Our artwork is awesome. And of course, if we can change it over more and expose it more, that has to be a win-win. So I'm really keen for us to do it. I don't know how we're going to do it, but if we can get a decent PPP, well, I think it'd be exciting. So I'm, very supportive of this.
Thanks, Councillor Summerfield. If there are no further questions, Mayor McDonald online, any questions? No? Oh, sorry, Councillor Shine, question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, where is it proposed that the 300,000 will come from?
You've got the finance bucket, Kerry.
Thank you, Councillor Carey. It is, this money would have to be funded operationally, given our accounting principles around how we develop these business cases. So we don't have the available funds in the 23-24 budget, either in the Library and Cultural Services budget or the Property Services budget, and this is something that we would have to plan for and allocate money for next financial year as our proposal in the report. So we've got some time as we prepare the budgets. This is something that we would ask the organisation and council to consider as we move forward into that. That effectively the money isn't available this financial year, but we're looking to plan for it to be available next financial year.
Thanks, Councillor Shine. Well, if there are no further questions, I do have a move it in a second, but also I forgot to acknowledge Sue Lostre down the back as well, of course, our Regional Coordinator of Arts, Galleries and Cultural Services. So thanks for coming along today. But I've got a mover in Councillor Melissa Taylor, I've got a seconder in Councillor Tim McMahon. Does anyone wish to go into debate? I'll put the vote. Those in favour? And that's a affirmative from the Mayor as well. So that one's unanimous. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, you. So, councillors, will move to item 5. Draft local law and subordinate local law amendments, shopping trolley management, community environment management amendment local law number 1, 2023, and community and environmental management amendment subordinate local law number 1, 2023. So the author of this report is to welcome forward the Manager of Environment Regulatory Services, to Kevin Jeffries, and also Manager Governance and Legal Services, Bailey Garcher. So, morning, Kevin. I'll hand over to yourself.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, councillors. You have before you a report about creating a local law or amending a local law to deal with shopping trolleys. As you may recall, back in March 2022, there was a council resolution to look at amending our local laws to deal with shopping trolleys. And then we did have an information session later on just to go through what the local law was proposed and the conditions and restrictions that were likely to be imposed. So the report, and I apologise for the long length of it, but we did have to cover a whole lot of issues. And it was a collaboration between Bailey's area and governance and ERS. So the report does canvass the fact that council needs to consider if the local law is the most appropriate way of dealing with shopping trolleys. You have that obligation under the law for any local law, not just for shopping trolleys. If it is, what the implications are around those. So we have highlighted there are some human rights issues, anti-discriminatory issues, anti-competition, resourcing issues, community benefits versus cost, and potential health and safety issues. If you accept those and consider those issues, obviously the next step is to start the local law process. So we're right at the beginning of that process, so this is the first or second step in that process. We would then have to get state review of it. We would have to go out to the public, public get the opportunity to have their say, make submissions. That all has to come back to council. So this is really the beginning part of it. If at any stage council, there were submissions and you considered those, you don't have to make the local law. You can make a decision at that point in time. But this is very much the front end part of that process. The whole context around the changes and the amendments is to require retailers, if they have more than 20 shopping trolleys available for customers' use, to have a trolley locking device or system to prevent those trolleys going outside the perimeter of those premises. So there are a number of devices already available and operating, and the local law, and I think I said in the report, local law doesn't stipulate the type of device, because in the future with technology changes, you'll find there will be other technologies that come on the market. So we didn't want to restrict by saying one particular type of device that should be used, but that opportunity for technology changes would be covered in is covered in the local law. I have highlighted around the resourcing of it. There is quite a bit of an implication if we want to do this properly and ensure that retailers are complying with the local law. So, and there's a range of areas and the amount of time that we commit to that. But we would be suggesting that there's a requirement to meet with all the retailers, obviously, and talk to them about the changes, talk to them about what's required from them, work through time frames, report that, go back and ensure that they have installed appropriate devices and audit that they are working as required, and then look at a auditing system, whether we audited all of the premises every year, or I've suggested probably more practical would be to do a third of them every year, so that they get canvassed every 3 years.
Good morning, councillors. Again, Kevin's covered most of it, so we've just raised important areas. Essentially, the table's ready to go. We've got a local law attached in draft form, and raised, what resourcing requirements. Issues in WHS and risks, they all can be managed and mitigated. It's internally just putting the process together. On the human rights, once again, the processes can be managed. So it's really essentially the key point is ongoing resourcing for implementation. That's probably the important matter to note, and that there would be, budget that needs to be put aside for that, essentially, once the local law is in play.
Thanks, Bailey. So, questions, Councillor O'Hara-Sullivan?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I just wanted to congratulate you on popping a wheelie. I don't think I've ever seen that in a report before, so well done, Kevin. Talking about that mechanism of the perimeter, and you say you don't want to specify what mechanism, yeah. So with this, you can circumvent that anyway, can you? Obviously.
Any system can be circumvented. So there are coin, and I think we said in the report, there's a coin-operated one which I think Aldi uses most of the time. I think some of the liquor outlets also use it. You put a coin in and it unlocks the trolley, and you take it back and get your coin back. Yes. There are instruments that can be used to circumvent that system. The other one is a perimeter, yes, and the trolley goes to that, the wheels lock up. But if people are forceful, they can get it over that system as well. There's none of them foolproof.
Yeah. I suppose I just found it interesting in the report that you mentioned that we'd only had 4 reported cases of complaints about abandoned trolleys in 2022. So would we be implementing this local law and having to then enforce it to sort of end up with the same result anyway? That's what I can't quite get my head around.
First off, I think I put a note in the report to be careful about those numbers, because we don't record specific shopping trolley complaints. They come in as a nuisance complaint. A lot of them are referred straight to Trolley Tracker or the people that Coles. We refer them to the Coles collectors. So even though, as we said, 4, if you look around, you'll see more than 4 trolleys. And most of the trolleys you do see are around the areas where the shopping malls are. So you'll see them outside around here, around Grand Central. You'll see them outside Clifford Gardens, all of those bigger ones. Clifford Gardens, you'll see trolleys down the road because there's a lot of retirement villages down there. There's a lot of individual flats down there, and I suspect most people use a trolley to transport their food home and then either take it back or just leave it out on the road. So the figures, all the information we've been able to gather and the discussions we had with Ipswich City Council is that they believe with the local law that they have, and ours is very similar to that, it has helped with the abandonment. Hasn't got rid of it, and no local law will ever get rid of it totally, but it has improved the situation.
Thanks, Councillor Harris-Sullivan. Councillor Shine.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report, Kevin. You mentioned two things. One is you mentioned that there's a limitation of 20, I think. I just wonder what the logic of that is. That what we're trying to address here is the abandonment of trolleys in outside private properties or in West Creek or whatever, and whether there's 20 or 40 at a shop, I just don't understand why that limitation is there. You might address that. And the other thing is that of concern, whilst I am very much in favour of steps being taken, I'm concerned that people who don't have a vehicle, vulnerable people, people with social housing, etc., who have to transport their groceries, carry them or use the shopping trolleys and then leave them outside their place or next door or whatever. How will they get on? Is there any way we can compel the store to provide some service whereby groceries can be delivered at the expense of the store as opposed to the customer? Or something has anything been looked at in that regard?
I'll cover off on the first one. The 20 shopping trolleys was just to cater for some of the very small businesses that have shopping trolleys, but not in significant numbers. And to have a perimeter or a locking device system is quite expensive for those small businesses. You can change that. It's in our subordinate local law, the 20 limit. If you were uncomfortable with that, you do have the ability to change that to a lower figure or a higher figure, whatever you consider. But the 20 is similar to what Ipswich has as well, City Council. So you get some small businesses that have a few trolleys. They tend to take more responsibility because they're easier to manage and the numbers are easier to manage. But you do have the right to change that figure.
On the second question, for a home delivery of those people in marginal sort of areas that need support, that would have to be a contract between the retailer and that individual, unless council would like to substitute that. So yeah, it'd be an arrangement. Currently, all those service providers do provide an arrangement where you can get home delivery for a small marginal fee. So it's a question of whether those retailers would be willing to contract with those individuals, and my answer is probably unlikely. And then the question is, if it's a concern for council, it would need to be a substitution back to those individuals on an application basis, which opens up a whole new paper and process.
Yeah, I can understand that it'd be pretty impracticable, but there's not an avenue via planning conditions that such a service be provided, perhaps.
Thanks, Councillor Shine. Councillor McMahon.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Kevin. Can I congratulate you on your work? If we look at attachment 1, where you've proposed the change, and this part 6A about regulation of shopping trolleys. So the purpose of this law that we tried to bring, that Councillor Summerfield from memory brought forward, was we have these unsightly shopping trolleys left in streets and parks and wherever, and rivers and lakes and all the rest of it, and we're trying to do our bit to stop that. So 6A has some interesting responsibilities for retailers and premises and identification and those kind of things. But my issue with it is that it also imposes rather unnecessary or perhaps harsh penalties on the people who may need the shopping trolley. So there's the premises who owns it, which fair enough, but the individual who may use the shopping trolley, I'm not sure we've arrived at the right point there. And I take your point in the report, it talks about human rights issues, and the elderly person or the lower socioeconomic, if they want to take the shopping trolley and walk their groceries home, because it's the only way they've got of getting their groceries home, and then they keep the shopping trolley till they go back to the shop the next day, like, I'm not going to get involved with that, but I think this law kind of prohibits those kind of proper use of shopping trolleys of what they're designed to be used for. So I have a few questions about specifically part 21B, which is leaving or taking a shopping trolley outside the retail premises. And if you just leave it there, Wendy, my first question is, we have local law officers who, we don't have a lot of them, but we do have local law officers. And so if we have an elderly person or someone from social housing who has taken a shopping trolley from a retail premises at a prescribed place and doesn't have written permission from the place, then our local law person can go up and give them a maximum penalty of 20 penalty units, which is a heck of a lot of money. Can I have an answer to that, please?
Yep. The maximum, when you look at the penalty units, the maximum penalty units prescribed by local law, council is only, through an infringement notice, can only charge 10% of that. So if it's 50 penalty units, it's
still. So if I'm hypothetically an elderly person walking from the shop to my home, and it's 400 metres from the shop, I'm outside of the designated place, our local law officer can then go up to them and give them a fine for doing that.
strictly speaking, yes, they could, but that's not the action, and we wouldn't do that in the first instance. If we had a resident person doing it on all the time, then the answer might be yes to that question. But if it was an elderly person taking the shopping trolley home, regardless of whether they've gone past the perimeter or not, takes it home, keeps it at her house and brings it back, is not going to actually cause us any. That's not what we're trying to address. Yes, by the letter of the local law, she would be breaking the law, but lots of people break laws, and for us, we would be focused on ensuring that the retailer's doing their part. If there's somebody that continually does it or continually leaves a trolley out on the street or in a creek or whatever it may be, yes, we would probably issue infringements in those cases, but you know, if they were taking the trolley home with their groceries, holding it home or bringing it back to the retailer, then we would encourage them to do that.
I suppose I feel a little bit uneasy about that, because you're saying we wouldn't do that, but the law does specifically say that, and we're being asked to sign off on the law which specifically says that. So whether your interpretation of it is different, it's still what we're signing off on, and I suppose I'm feeling a bit uneasy about that. My second question is, and it's still on there, Part B, the reasonable excuse, which is a defence to taking it out of the prescribed place. Could a reasonable excuse be it's my only mode of transport home? Like, what's an example of a reasonable excuse? Top of the page.
It's left broad, so you can discretionally apply it for all these unknown circumstances that you're raising. So when we draft the law, essentially we've got to be able to apply it. Okay, so in circumstances, so it's got to be. So this is very similar local law to Ipswich, by the way. If you've read through the reports, you can see that all the documentary says that they haven't eliminated the issue, but they're moving the right way to reduce it. Okay, so all local laws we have, you don't apply them 100% all the time. Everyone that's breaking the law, there will always be discretionary application for the compliance officers. So that's what that's for. To sit there, if the compliance officer said in that circumstances, I've just been to the medical centre and I don't have my car, I'm not allowed to drive, giving you a unique one. The doctor said, I've been to the dentist, can't hop behind a car for the next 12 hours, I need to go to the groceries to pick up my medication, I couldn't carry them. Someone turns around to the compliance officer and gives all that sort of representation. The compliance officer says, okay, technically under my job I could apply a fine here, but however I can look at the local law and say I can be reasonable with this person. So that's what the discretionary out is. We can't cover every circumstance. I've given you one that you probably didn't think about. Going to the dentist, not allowed to drive for the next 12, 14 hours, need to go and pick up your medication. So each case will be, the purpose of the local law is you don't know the application until you put it in, but what's been proven at Ipswich by having a local law that you can apply in all circumstances if you have to, okay, has reduced their issue, the unsightly. If you wanted to cover all your issues, we'd have to say, look, we could apply that fine, but however, these are all the carve-outs. So the question is, then you'll be debating with people, is that the real reason they took that trolley to there? And they've got 5 of them sitting outside of that location. So you've got to have a strict application, but then a very generic provision to allow compliance officer act reasonably. And that's how it's set up, and that's how local laws are set up. So that's principally, but however, if you'd like specific carve-outs, we can take the feedback and we can put them all in. Then they also need application as well on each case of interpretation. But we're here for feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'll just follow up. I feel like 21B is either, like if I was walking along with the shopping trolley, I wouldn't want a local officer coming up to me and go, what's your reasonable excuse? I wouldn't want that, right? And so I feel like either it's an overuse of privacy power, or on the alternative, it's a toothless tiger because everyone can get away with it that needs to. I'm uneasy about 21B being in there, and I completely support the obligations on the shop, the owner, but the one on the person using the shopping trolley, I don't think that this section actually achieves very much at all. So I might have some other questions, but maybe come back to it at a later time. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor McMahon. Councillor Farquhar.
Thank you, Chair. I find shopping trolleys really unsightly. I've often had them dumped out the front of my business, and getting rid of them is really difficult from a business owner's perspective. I guess putting on my council hat though, and just looking at the overall resource implication of actually running this, the ongoing auditing, you've got your auditing, you've got your 400 hours a year, you've got approximate cost of running it at $120,000 a year. I'm just wondering how this fits into our budget, considering we're looking at all these other costs, reductions in other areas.
Through the Chair, at the moment it doesn't, because this local law, as I said at the beginning, is step 2 of 11-step process. So it won't be in place this financial year, so it would have to be consideration for next financial year's budget, along with everything else that has to be considered. So yeah, there's no funding at this stage for it, but it won't be required until next financial year, so July next 2024 at the earliest. In fact, this local law probably won't be in place, considering we've got elections coming up as well. It probably won't be in place till later next financial year.
Thank you.
Councillor Summerfield.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Kevin, for finally getting the shopping trolley policy here for us to actually have a look at. I appreciate there's been an extraordinary amount of work done, a bit of research and whatever. I did have trouble finding positives in the report, but I did find a few and grasp those. Thank you. I did note, and Councillor Megan brought it up about the 4 complaints, and I reckon I sent 4 complaints in on email just last year alone, and one of them had about 15 trolley photos in them. So there are complaints out there. But of course, the other thing is people probably don't even think to complain to council when they see a Woolies or a Coles shopping trolley. They think bloody Woolies, or sorry, that was a technical term. The complaints, I was concerned that was a bit skewed because of that, but you did explain that So thank you for that. And it also mentioned that council staff are only collecting 1 or 2 a month, that's not because of a lack of trolleys. They're out there. It's just that staff don't happen to be in those areas, or whatever the reason why. There are a whole lot out there. And of course, we've already proposed a new law 19 months ago, didn't we? On the 15th of March, wasn't that the resolution that we would actually do a new law? Whereas I felt like this was questioning whether we would or not. But on B102, it talks about reputational risk, and I felt it didn't mention the eyesores in our garden city, our beautiful city, and I think that should have been included as well in our reputational risk. It is a reputational risk when you've got shopping trolleys all over the place, so I think that should have been included. In relation to the workplace health and safety, I was glad that was included, but it should also be noted that council and third-party trolley owners already do this, so it's not an increased risk, but rather once the locking systems are in place, it will be a reduced risk. That's assuming that this may or may not be endorsed today, but if it is and it does end up in place and those locking systems are in place, we're going to have less trolleys that are going to pose a risk to either council or third-party collectors of shopping trolleys collecting them, because there'll be less. On Board Books 106, it talks about hiring a contractor to patrol the streets. I'd be concerned about that. I gathered that was in there as an option, was it? That could have been considered, and my concern with that would have been that competitive neutrality that council has to abide by, that we could be stepping into something when there's already a business out there collecting those. It's probably the only other thing that I wanted to raise. And then apart from that, a timeline, and you did mention that you thought it would probably be towards the end of next year, and I'd be comfortable with that if that's what the plan is. Because I know it takes a while to do the consultative process and all that sort of thing. But on the reason I'm questioning that is it's taken 19 months since our March decision to get this report, and I'd be comfortable so long as it is by the end of next year. But if it's going to take 2 years or something, I'd prefer that there was a timeline for delivery of outcomes in the motion. If you don't mind commenting on that, just to reassure me. Thanks, Kevin.
So just to cover off on a few of those, I think I've remembered most of them. The reputational risk, we could have covered that in there. We did talk about, right throughout the report, about the amenity factor of shopping trolleys, you know, in our communities and the impact that does have on the amenity throughout the report. We could have had it in there as well. And the work health safety, you're quite right, we've got that risk now. We're not saying it was increased risk. We just had to identify it for you. And yes, some of it does, some of the comments may sound negative, but we needed to, there is an obligation just to inform council that we have to, and you have to consider whether it's human rights or the whole local law processing consideration and decision-making process. I apologise if it sounded negative, but it is what it is. But overall, if you take that into consideration, I still think this is a good idea. The next step is to go through the state review and get the local law out for advertising. And one, Councillor McMahon did mention earlier about concern about we are signing off. You are only signing off for the next step of the process, which means it goes out for consultation. If people have real concerns about some of the elements and conditions in this local law or subordinate local law, they can make submissions and you can change it. Sorry, just to finish. So yes, I do think by the time we get through this process, considering we've got the election and you can't make decisions on local laws prior to, I suspect it will be about September next year.
Thanks, Councillor Summerfield. I've got Councillor Carl.
Thanks, Chair. Kevin, Am I interpreting this as we're locked into a process now because of a decision back to make a local law? Is this because it says draft local law, so we're in a non-returnable process here?
It's just to say start the journey and proceed. We have to take submissions externally and go through a process. So we're locked into a process, but you're not locked into a local law because we'll have to bring it back with the feedback and submission.
Yeah, there's consultation.
So we're virtually starting the process, and we started that process back in a little while back in March. So the process started, we're continuing the process. You're not rubber stamping the final local law because we'll bring back feedback, etc. Part of the consultation process.
So I guess my question is, because we've decided to enact a local law, when we get to the end of the consultation process, can we go decide yes or no, we want to go ahead with the local law?
Yes, you may, because you still have to rubber stamp it.
Yeah. Okay. Because Councillor Edwina raises a really good point. If we go to financial implications on 106 of 228 of board books, and I can't get the number, sorry, in the report on the page. For some reason it chops it off out there. By the way, thanks, that would be most helpful for lots of things, multifaceted items in a financial implications format in a report. This is really helpful. I just can't help thinking there is some inequity. We get to annually pay our, fund this at 120 grand, and for some businesses to not be doing the right thing by not policing their own property, for the want of a better expression. I have a suggestion, Chair, because I fear, as we know we're growing, we know our urban footprint's growing, we know we're going to end up with more larger commercial centres, and the existing activity centres will continue. They have a degree of growth in them yet, an expansion. It's called population growth. I fear that this becomes unsustainable, approaching it like this. I'd rather see if we could go back to the front end here and look at our possibilities around the DA process in planning, and see if we can actually investigate a condition of application with these centres or enterprises with over 20 shopping trolleys. It is a non-negotiable. It's not an acceptable outcome. It's a performance outcome in the development application process, where they must demonstrate that they have this system in place, locking, or a various use of technology to actually control their asset. Because we're getting the general public to pick up the tab for others not controlling their physical asset. So I'm wondering whether we shouldn't do that in the course of, we still have to go through the process. I get that, we've enacted the local laws process, but I would like us to investigate that option, because that is much more sustainable. It places the onus on the entity rather than the general rate base to actually help manage this problem moving forward. So I'm very uneasy with. So are we voting for this draft to go out to consultation, and we're only doing that? We're not voting to accept it as a local law.
Through the chair, no. I think I said there's about 11 steps in this process. Yep. You're at step 2. Yep. Through this process, we have to get state review as well, and we have to go out for public consultation, and there'll be submissions will come through, and I'm sure there'll be a number of submissions on this local law. Some of the bigger retailers like Woolworths, Coles, Dan Murphy, they will be made aware of it. I listed in the report, I think it was about 78 premises that we are aware of. I'm sure we've missed some, but they'll use that number to try and work out what this would potentially cost us to audit and implement. But we will, obviously part of that consultation is there will be public advertising, but we will be sending information to those representatives.
Well, and what really concerns me is with the growth of of physical infrastructure, where these entities will, entities over 20 shopping trolleys will locate in the future, both through infill and greenfield. You can rest assured that the input costs for the management of this, both whether we choose to contract some of this out, and as you say in the report, we've still got to perform some of those local laws, those functions under the local law legislatively. So with rising input costs, we can expect well in excess of 120 per annum moving forward. So I'd like, I think could we, Chair, through you, General Manager Nick, Acting CEO, perhaps ask Carrie and Nicola if they could make some consideration around this, and if in fact we can do that. We mightn't be able to, but I think it's a reasonable consideration given that it's part of their physical infrastructure, it's part of their asset that any responsible property owner is required to manage and not have the general rate base subsidise it. So.
We can take that on note and question whether you can implement something like that into a planning condition. My only comment is that the local law is more about managing continuous improvement and compliance. The development approval will be completed. So the costs that are put in here are future compliance management, and that can only be administered through the local law because the development approval will have those conditions, but the development will be completed. It won't help you. It won't have a section in how you manage compliance. It'll say you build this type of. It's a good idea. I don't know whether it's enforceable under the planning legislation, but to put a development condition is this is the type of trolling bay. If they in their application got a trolley bay, whether you can set the type of trolley bays in a development, prove it sort of starts it from the beginning of what we're trying to achieve now.
Yeah,
okay,
look,
but the local law is going to be necessary for compliance. So
I'm saying it's not an and or either or. It's an and I'm saying we probably, if we're going to go ahead with this, we need to mitigate the expenses moving forward. So. And the one I always think that is defensible in a P&E court is around amenity. And if we're talking about social amenity and impacts and visual amenity of the pollution of shopping trolleys at, wherever, I think that's a defensible and a reasonable point to argue down the track. So I'm saying it might be a combination of two. I'm not saying either or. It could be a combination of two because we're going to have to mitigate these costs moving forward if we decide to go ahead with this.
Through Chair, we can certainly follow up. There's pretty strict conditions about what sort of conditions can be put on planning applications, and a lot of the planning applications for some of these bigger malls, they don't tell us what's going in there because quite often they don't know. But even if there was conditions on that, there's still going to be an obligation around ensuring that they do work.
Thanks, Councillor Carl. We've got Councillor Melissa Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Just before I start, can I just ask everyone to make sure their microphones are a little bit closer to their mouths when they're speaking? Just makes it a bit easier. Thank you. Great idea, Councillor Carl. I didn't think of that, and I think that's really worth investigating, and I totally agree with it's the responsibility of the owner to control their assets. I couldn't park my trucks on a footpath. I had to control my trucks and provide and pay rent for a facility to put them in. So it's a business's responsibility. So I think that's really worthy of investigation. Not that they're my trucks anymore, but anyway. Moving on. I actually agree with Councillor McMahon about 21B, but I just don't know the answer. And my reasoning is, it is so subjective for the compliance officer. And, you know, I look at the local law at the moment, which I am receiving so many complaints about. A lot of residents are being fined for putting two wheels up on a footpath. And they're doing it from a safety perspective, because to put a vehicle on the road with four wheels on the road is a safety hazard, particularly for a lot of tradies at the moment. And they're being fined for having two wheels up on a footpath that is not obstructing anyone or anything, particularly residents or emergency services, and they're saying that it's a safety issue, that's why they're doing it, but they're still being fined. So it's, you know, to have that subjectivity, I really struggle with that. And again, I don't know the reason, and we are possibly hurting marginalised groups that really need the trolley to get to a bus stop or to get to their home, and or for not being able to drive after a dentist appointment. So, you know, to put that subjectivity on a compliance officer, you know, and nothing against compliance officers, but they might be having a bad day, or it might be they might be really hot and sweaty at 3 o'clock of an afternoon after a really tough day, and they just want to go home. So, you know, there's so many things that can affect a decision, that the unintended consequences then to the person, you know, is unfair. So I just, as I said, I don't know the answer, but I will be very interested to see what the feedback will be when we go out to public consultation. But I just think that subjectivity when it comes to local laws, particularly the footpath parking one, is an issue.
As restated earlier, look, we're here for feedback. So it's just whether you want to put exceptions in there and carve-outs. There may be some obvious ones that you've mentioned, okay? So it's a question whether you want us to go back to the drawing board and submit a draft for this council to consider with some carve-outs, like exceptions. We've modelled it on what we've seen elsewhere. That council that organisation may have a different view on carve-outs. It's just a question. So the answer is documenting. Obviously, your carve-out list is not going to be 200, but if there's some generic carve-outs that you want to put in there, which guides the intent application on certain things, which takes it out of the discretionary, and the compliance officer says, look, that's what that individual said to me, that clearly falls out in the carve-out, off we go. So realistically, we're here for feedback, and it's your guidance in the local law whether you want certain carve-outs put in there. But obviously that will mean we have to go back to the table and bring that back to you, and we're open to that, but it's in the councillor's hands. So there is an answer to it. We've heard some examples of carve-outs that you've mentioned today. It's just a question of whether you'd like us to draft some of those carve-outs into your local law for consideration.
I think it's really important that we address the issue, and it's just how we address the issue, because urban litter, you know, it's really unsightly. And again, that was actually one of the great pieces of feedback we got when we did the public consultation for scooters in our region. You know, that urban litter is very unsightly, and we've got a beautiful reputation for a gorgeous garden city, and we don't want to ruin that. But having the carve-outs in there, it'll have to be not limited to. But I'm happy at the moment. I just wanted to voice my opinion and my feedback, but I'm happy for it to go to public opinion first and get the feedback and then address it from there. So,
through Chair, just to add, you're talking about some of the parking fines and the two wheels. that's not actually covered under our local laws. That's covered under TORMs. So we have less TORMs. Yeah, so we have less flexibility with some of that. But for all of our offences and infringements, so whether it's parking or whether it's animal management or development compliance, whatever it might be, we do have an internal review process for those infringements. So even under here, there would be an internal review process. And then after that, there's another legal process that they have available to them if they're not satisfied with the outcome of decision.
Thank you, Kevin, and I do know all of that. But if you've got, someone with, say for example, a disability, to then go down the track of having to refute it and go through that legal process, or the process of, can be daunting. So it's to take all that into account can be just something we can keep in mind. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Taylor. Councillor O'Hara-Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kevin, sorry for being a bit thick, but is the I see the figure. The contract would likely to be around $60,000. So to enforce that, and then you see the contractor would to clean up the trolleys would be 90,000, and then we've got another figure here for 112,000. What I'm concerned about is at what point, if that doesn't sit well with you and your voting, could we say now, I'm not going to support that in the long term, and I don't think that any more work should be done on this. Are we at that point now? That's what I don't understand.
Sorry, Kevin, would you like me to answer that?
Yeah.
My answer is no. There could be a number of non-tangible benefits to the community, which we've mentioned today, reputation to events in Toowoomba Regional Council. So the dollar sign is what we've put to you and said we've been productive, as Councillor Cahill said. We've put something together to show you, look, to do this properly, this is how you do it properly. My answer is no, that we're not at a point of stop. I think we're at a point of, okay, we've realised there's benefits in it because another council has demonstrated there's a reduction in shopping trolleys if you have a local law. Okay, we don't know the benefit that would be available for the Toowoomba Regional Council until you actually implement it and see what the continuous education program and the benefits, because there are non-tangible benefits you can't measure financially as returns. We've given you the cost of application, okay, so we couldn't tell you what the benefits are of it reducing. Okay, so they're the costs sort of saying, look, that's the problem now. Okay, that cost may vary based on, if you look at Ipswich, they've reduced, those costs would reduce as the issue reduces. So we've sort of put down and said, look, this is roughly how we would manage it. So my answer is no, we're not at a point where we stop it. We're at a point where we sort of have a look at it because it's been demonstrated by implementing a local law, you can improve it by another local council. So my advice would be to continue on the process.
Thanks, Councillor O'Hara-Sullivan. Councillor Shine.
Thanks, Chair. Just mention that issue raised by Councillor Bill about the planning legislation being used to impose conditions would be interesting and I think positive. But my question relates to the fact that of recent times, and we get in front of our house about once a month, we get a benefit of a empty trolley out the footpath in the front of the house. But recent times there hasn't been telephone numbers on the trolley, whereas in the past I think there has been. I noticed that there is under 221F a requirement to identify it. But I think that in the past the telephone number was sort of a call centre like Centrelink, and you have to wait as long as you do Centrelink as well, which is no solution whatsoever because people give up after a few hours. And I'm just wondering if if you're framing that it could be, you know, a local number has to be made available or attached to the trolley. And the other thing is that if you're lucky enough to get onto them finally, to tell them it's there, please pick it up, can you impose a time limit for them within which they have to pick it up? You know, there is a 60-day or 60 something days to comply with the identification process that you've mentioned there, 21F. But I was just wondering if you, after a resident or a citizen or whatever makes the call, that within so many hours, 12, 24, that they are required to, the owner of the trolley, is required to pick it up.
The only way we would be able to do that is through the issuing of a compliance notice, and we put a time frame on that, which has to be a reasonable time frame. So if it's a local supermarket, it might be 12, 24 hours that is to be collected. We wouldn't be able to impose that time frame on an independent company that's potentially
Not in our subsection here saying that such a action has to be complied with within 12, 24 hours or something like that, as part of your local law?
You could.
how do you manage it?
Yeah.
Thanks, Councillor Shine. If there are no further questions in this matter, there is a recommendation or Councillor McMahon, sorry, question?
Chair, would you mind if I made a comment?
Sure. Are you moving something at the end of it, or?
Look, I suppose I have been sitting here going back and forward and thinking strenuously about this. 21B has not sat well with me. And I suppose where I've ended up is that if you're the average person who is elderly, is disabled, is a low social income, doesn't have a car and needs to take a shopping trolley home, we do have a reasonable excuse law, and we also have the ability, if you talk to your shop owner and say, hey, can I take this? Maybe the responsibility is on the shop owner to get a little piece of paper that says, I'll lawfully give you permission, hand them out. We need to start the conversation about shopping trolleys in our streets, the unsightliness of them, and you know, I do want the local officers to have the power to use local laws on things like a group of kids throwing a shopping trolley into the lake. So I have stressed about this, but I'm on board. just to chat the officers where I'm at.
Thanks, Councillor. Okay, right. Second, yes. So I've got a mover in Councillor McMahon, I've got a seconder in Councillor Summerfield. Does anyone wish to go into debate? I'll put the motion. Sorry, Mayor McDonald, sorry, did you have any questions or? He's left. Right, okay, so we'll take that as a no. So I will put it to the vote. Those in favour? Those against? It's carried. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Bailey. Thanks, councillors. So that does conclude the Environment and Community Committee meeting for the month of October. So I'll hand over to, go straight to Finance and Business Strategy. We can do that.
Welcome to the Finance and Business Strategy Committee meeting of the Toowoomba Regional Council. This meeting is open to the public and will also be live streamed. Excuse me. I would like to thank those of you who are in the room with us today and acknowledge everyone watching via Council social media channels. I acknowledge the acting CEO, the General Manager, and Andrew Wegner, and other support staff who are here this morning. I acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse these lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, Guayabal and Jarawar peoples, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge, rich traditions and bold ambitions of Australia's first peoples. I don't know if there are any apologies. There can't be any leave of absence and declarations at this stage, I don't think. Councillor Carol Taylor has leave, and Councillor Jeff McDonald, the Mayor, has been attending on Teams, but he may not be any longer. Okay. I don't think there are any declaration of prescribed conflicts of interest. So the first item on the agenda is the quote or tender consideration plan for the disposal of assets. Pass on to Anne-Marie.
Good morning, councillors. So happy to hand this one over to Andrew for an introduction and to take any questions you may have.
Thanks, Anne-Marie, and good morning, councillors. So the quote or tender consideration plan that's put before you is in compliance with Section 230 of the Local Government Regulation to support the disposal of unwanted council items without first seeking quotes or tenders. The table of involved parties for conflict of interest purposes is as attachment 1. So the disposal of valuable non-current assets excluding lands, there's exceptions for provided under the regulation for not seeking quotes or tenders. So we can, by bringing this forward to council and looking at the quoted tenders consideration plan and adopting the plan, provides council with the authority to dispose of the assets. The plan is to provide a compliant framework within which council officers may dispose of the unwanted items by way of recycling through the tip shop, but which may result in a profit share outcome with an external organisation. The plan is for the disposal of assets, provides the information required to comply with the regulation and justifies the use of the plan as an effective and appropriate method for disposal of assets. And the plan says as attachment 2, and I hand over to questions.
Any questions? There being no questions, I'll ask somebody to move the recommendation. Edwina, Councillor Edwina, Councillor Mel, seconder. Any discussion? Any desire to go into debate? All those in favour? Carried. Thank you. It's proposed that we delay the sponsorship policy matter and go to fees and charges as Emily is here at the moment, if that's okay. Which is item do we? Okay. Apparently we need a motion to vary the order of business. So could somebody move that we now deal with the item Register 2023-24 Register of Fees and Charges updates to the register. Councillor Deputy Mayor, and it's seconded by Councillor Bill. Any discussion? All those in favour? Carried. Thank you. Straight to Emily, please. Emily.
Good morning, councillors. The purpose of this report is to consider some proposed changes to the 23-24 Register of Fees and Charges that have been identified since the adoption of the register. So these include some minor changes and also the changes for the aquatics and indoor sports centres that have since been outsourced as per previous council decisions. So the aquatics and indoor sports centres that have been outsourced, they're all shown in attachment 1, and then we also have some minor changes shown in attachment 2. The recommendation is to adopt the changes as per attachment 1 and 2.
Any questions? Yes. Councillor Summerfield.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Emily. The aquatic centre, I don't know whether this is the right place to ask this or not, but I saw some complaints the other day that the prices have gone up, and I think it was at Milne Bay, that the prices had gone up significantly. Do we have control over that in our contracts that we do with through the tender process, that contract that is then put in place? Do we have control over how much that can actually go up or not? And tell me if I'm asking this in the wrong place. Maybe I should be directing it at... but I was concerned that they were saying that the prices had gone up quite a bit to the previous year, and I just wondered where we stood in that process. Thanks.
CEO. I might provide more detailed advice to councillors via email, and happy to have a subsequent session if we need to. The answer to your question, though, briefly, is we do have control over some of the prices, and those being these casual entry prices. Some of those other multi-pass prices and other things that we charge or that are charged there are at the discretion of the operator in a commercial environment. In relation to the matter that you're discussing, I saw something on that yesterday or the day before. It's just been this week. And I've seen an explanation around that, and I'm very satisfied with the response. It's been a very generous response from the operator, and I'd be happy to share that with councillors to give you some comfort around that.
Councillor Edwina. Yep.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question in relation to the increases and how you came to them. I just noticed that they're all around about 7 to 9%, except for the family, which is item 379 at the bottom of page 213. The family passes have just gone up 18.9%. So it's almost double the others. I was just curious why.
Thank you.
Those changes to the specific register of fees and charges would have been presented through the development of the 23-24 annual budget. This is just updating the deleting some fees out and maintaining those. So those specific questions to those increases, I'll have to take that on notice and let you know what commentary was provided at the time for those increases.
Councillor Bill, Tim, rather.
It's actually good to see you looking after the families with 4 kids, by the way, in there. Look, I read this and you said minor change and the whole thing's red, but I absolutely understand why, because we don't look at that anymore. But I probably should have asked this when all the changes happened with aquatics, that we look after, still set the price for casual entry, which is why it's still on the register, but things like school visits and all of that is completely out of our hands now. So I think that's already been asked, Nick, so I'll take it on notice. Otherwise, happy to move. Thank you.
Any further questions at all? If not, I'll ask, Councillor Tim will move that Council adopt the proposed amendments to 2023-24 Register of Fees and Charges as per attachments 1 and 2. Councillor Edwina, seconded. All those in favour? Carried. Thank you. We can now revert back to the original order or adjourn for lunch, but whichever you prefer. Make a start, there we go.
Morning, councillors. I bring to you the sponsorship policy. I'm here on behalf of Kylie, and there'll be some latecomers coming in the areas of council who deal most with sponsorship opportunities. Andrew and Eddie from Community Development Facilities and Tourism, as well as Tony from Economic Development, will be coming in very soon, hopefully to answer any specific questions. This is a regular review of the sponsorship policy. The review to date has included input from staff, internal auditors have provided comment. Councillors, we've had 2 information sessions with you on this policy. The review has also included the formation of 2 working groups to bring this input together. One group to handle outgoing sponsorship and another one for the incomings. And then finally, we've brought all this together in the document before you, and I understand that all the raised points have been catered for in the reviewed policy. Of note, the policy, the changes, there's 3 changes of note, lots of little changes, but of note 3 changes, clarifying what sponsorship is and what it is not. Secondly, explaining what principles we are working to when considering sponsorship opportunities, and thirdly, changing the approval delegations by reducing from 4 to 3 categories as requested by councillors. The recommendation before you is to 1, adopt the revised sponsorship policy, and 2, just in case there's ambiguity, delegate the consideration of approvals for outgoing sponsorships of large and approvals for incoming sponsorships of $50,000 plus under council's sponsorship policy to the Chief Executive Officer during the 2024 local government election caretaker period. Bit of a mouthful. Any questions?
Thank you, Daniel. Any questions? Councillor Summerfield?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Daniel. So just on page 162 on board books, or is there a number on the, 2 of 9, this is in the track changes document. Up the top there's 2 dot points, and I'm sure we raised concerns about this previously when we've looked at this sponsorship policy just quite recently, I thought. So the 2nd dot point says sponsorship must not involve explicit endorsement of the sponsor or the sponsor's products. That's a bit hard when they're going to be, a part of what has to happen is they have to acknowledge that we've sponsored their event as part of the process. So that's a bit hard to say then, oh, well, you're not allowed, you must not involve explicit endorsement of the sponsor. The sponsors could have a sign up somewhere with council's logo on it saying sponsored by Toowoomba Regional Council, which is part of their requirement under the funding, that they have to do that. So I feel that that's in conflict of the opposite side of it, which is the requirements of what they must do as a result of getting that sponsorship. That's assuming we're sponsoring something, right? So say we're sponsoring, I'll use Meatstock because I'm going to use that the next one as well. We're sponsoring Meatstock. We then say, well, Meatstock, we're going to give you this $20,000 or whatever it is for your event. You must now do an acknowledgement of that on your signage. So it works against. Maybe you could find different wording for that, but it does work against one of the requirements when they receive sponsorship from council.
It might be that it's a question of the difference between endorsing the product as opposed to acknowledging the sponsorship.
Well, Meatstock is a product, so...
Yeah, so my understanding through the chair, in that circumstance, we're talking about council sponsoring other events rather than incoming sponsorships. And so in that circumstance, we might be saying that while we might be sponsoring Meatstock as an event, we don't necessarily go around promoting them in exclusivity to anything else.
So
Did that
maybe
make sense?
it needs a bit of wordsmithing, could I suggest? To reflect what you, and I hear what you're saying, and it probably just needs a bit of wordsmithing to reflect that. So then the next dot point says an employee of council or councillor must not receive benefit from a sponsor. This is the one that we have discussed before, and I'll use Meatstock as an example. They give us free tickets as a result of that sponsorship, and both staff and councillors take up those free tickets where applicable. So that we asked previously for that not to.
Yes, I've got that one in my notes here, and my understanding is where it's included as part of the, that's talking about outside the sponsorship agreement. Where it's part of the sponsorship agreement, that will be negotiated. That's part of the package, and so that's not considered a gift. What's the words there?
I see. You're saying that when they apply for the sponsorship, they don't say we will give you 6 tickets to Meatstock. What happens is the agreement is done, and then after that, they then say, well, look, we'll give you 6 tickets. Is that
Correct.
what you're saying?
Then that would be outside the policy. So it would have to be negotiated as part of the policy, and therefore it's a consideration of the sponsorship, and therefore it's part of the sponsorship arrangement. And there's not things that happen on the sideline to that that would be in breach of the policy.
Well, now that's just confused me more.
Okay. So, for an example, in the case of an event like Meatstock, the negotiations might include a number of tickets made available to the organisation. That would be part of the negotiation of the sponsorship arrangement. If after that they said, and by the way, here's a free barbecue for you, Daniel, for organising this, that would be in breach of the policy.
Right. So I'm on the money then. So it's saying there that an employee of council or councillor must not receive benefit from a sponsor. We've just said that as part of the negotiation, we get 6, we'll say 6 tickets, whatever it might be. We get 6 tickets. That would be a benefit from the sponsor. No.
Well, that would be part of the
It's not a,
the
it's a
sponsorship
benefit
agreement.
from the sponsorship agreement.
That's part of the equation of the benefits to the organisation as the sponsorship agreement.
An employee of council must not receive benefit from a sponsor. But we're actually sponsoring if it's Meatstock. We're actually the sponsor.
I'm not sure how else I can explain it.
The acting CEO.
May I offer a
Thanks,
suggestion?
Nick.
If we were to say an employee of council or councillor must not receive benefit from a sponsor, save for those included in the sponsorship agreement or outside of the sponsorship agreement or something like that.
I like it. Thank you.
So we make that. So an employee of council or councillor must not receive benefit from a sponsor outside of the sponsorship agreement.
Okay. Excellent.
That's it, Councillor. Councillor Edwina.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is outside the sponsorship agreement. And then I think in the point above, if we change the word potentially sponsorship must not involve, maybe we include the beginning of the sentence below, an employee of council or councillor must not involve explicit endorsement. Because then we're saying it's council that's not explicitly endorsing the product, just to clarify that. Councillor or councillor must not explicitly endorse the sponsor or the sponsor's product outside of the agreement. So whatever's included that we agree upon within the sponsorship agreement, absolutely. Tickets or endorsement on banners, signage, etc. Totally agreed. But outside of that,
I think.
Any further questions?
Does that get it?
Yeah, it just clarifies that it's yeah, council or council officer. Yep. Thank you.
Any further questions? So, yeah, Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Chair. Just with that one that we were wordsmithing, I had hoped someone else would have a question. It would give me a little bit of time to think of an example. I'm just wondering, there might be instances where we fall foul of that as an unintended, accidental and well-intentioned part of doing our job. And I'll give an example as I'm trying to just come up with one. Say we get a sponsorship request for, Endeavour Road Rally. And we, in our ordinary jobs, are approached by Endeavour, or we just personally believe in their work, and we go to Endeavour and we give attention to the work that the organisation does, and what does an explicit, what was the word? Explicit endorsement. Where are the lines, I guess, with explicit endorsement? Where are we falling in and out of that? I just gave the Endeavour Foundation as an example, but there might be, many others.
I'm not sure I understand the question, sorry, Councillor.
Well, I'm not sure how else to ask the question, so we seem to be at an impasse.
The intention of that clause is to, perhaps if we start there, the intention of that clause is to ensure, to provide some guidance so that the sponsorship arrangement contains the different parameters of what we're promoting and what we're not promoting. And so that outside of that, we're not going off and doing our own thing or doing something in conflict to that. That's the intent, I understand, of that clause.
I wish I had a live and good example. I just think in our jobs we are involved in a ton of with a ton of organisations, from community groups to sporting organisations to also, trade and investment, tourism, all the rest of it. So, and we go and we meet with these people and we raise awareness of the work that they're doing. Is that explicit endorsement of their work, of the organisation? Anyway, if no one else has an issue with it, that's where it is. But I think that's going to be a problem, and I intend to vote against it for that reason.
It's bad for interpretation. Councillor Edwina?
No, I was just following on from Councillor Von Hoff. I think we do have to be careful, given that we do tag all sorts of events and people in, and I guess the ones that we're not sponsoring is fine, but looking at, say, Carnival of Flowers or something that we do sponsor, we just need to make sure that we're covered by personally through our socials, for example, are covered, that we can promote attendance at certain events explicitly. I guess it comes down to the wording, yeah. And just to make sure that the wording does cover that we can promote events personally that we as council sponsor that we may not have included in the sponsorship agreement, I guess is where we're coming from. And just to make sure that that wording covers us.
Do you want to comment on that? I'll go to the next question.
Councillors, through the chair, my only suggestion would be that clause could be changed from the negative to the positive. So rather than saying what's excluded, deal with it in the positive. And what I mean by that would be to explain that all the benefits of a sponsorship agreement will be included in the sponsorship agreement, or something along those lines. That way it's dealing specifically with the sponsorship agreement, and it's dealing with the issue of things, negotiations or backhanders happening outside the agreement, which is the intent of that. I'm in your hands.
Councillor Summerfield.
Thanks, Chair. So I couldn't understand before what Councillor Rebecca was getting at, and now I feel like it's clicked into place. So if you think about, and I will keep using Meatstock because I think it is a good example, but I could get into trouble for continually using their name under this. But so say we did get a free ticket, we went out to it and took photos while we were out there and put it on our social media, we would actually be promoting that event. And it's what we do. It's what we do with everything, whether we're going to the Girl Guide tent or we're going to the CWA or we're going to Meatstock or Carnival of Flowers. Part of our role, we take photos and promote so that other people will go. So we would be caught up in that. Thanks, Rebecca, because I just couldn't get what you were getting at, but
That's certainly not the intention to put any encumbrances on that, and if that's the case, I'd suggest we just remove that line.
I think we should, because it's loaded otherwise and could be caught up in the simplest little thing. Yeah, very easily. Thanks.
Am I missing anything, Eddie or Andrew?
Good afternoon, councillors, and obviously I've been part of these discussions for some time now with this review. I think maybe the examples we are focusing on there are all, very positive and most likely, I would imagine, the types of sponsorships we'd be looking to enter into, given that they're either community organisations that are doing great work in the community, and we should all be getting behind and supporting those organisations as they're, endorsing their organisation and the work they do. Perhaps, and I've been trying to think of an example, theoretical example, but if there is a case where there's more of a commercial entity as such, that has a specific product or brand or an organisation that is more commercial in nature, of which, at whatever the opportunity might be, council decides to sponsor whatever that proposal is and support that proposal, we're not then ongoing endorsing of their product or their service. It's very hypothetical.
Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Chair. Okay, I've got an example. So say there's a Clydesdales St George game, and NRL comes to Toowoomba Regional Council and says, Toowoomba Regional Council, we're asking for some sponsorship for this. It's going to be a great community event, great for the region. We agree, we grant the sponsorship, we go to a game and we're wearing a Clydesdales hat. That's why that's a problem as it stands at the moment. It's just a minor thing, but we need to just be aware that that would be a consequence, and in my opinion, it would catch us all very quickly and easily.
Could I make a suggestion then? If just looking at page 162, so that very first stop point there, where sponsorship involves the sponsor providing a product to council, council must evaluate that product for its fitness for purpose against objective criteria and the procurement process relevant to council's needs. So we've already reviewed it at that stage. So that's the first stage. And the decision has been made that we are endorsing it. If council decides that they're going to sponsor a particular event, we've carried out that evaluation. So there's no need then for that second dot point. And then the third dot point, as Daniel has suggested, we'll make that a positive point that everything is included in the sponsorship agreement. all the benefits for councillors included in the agreement.
Councillor Bill?
Further to Councillor Rebecca's example, we might have qualified it, but I get a photo with the gun player while I'm at that event, and I post it up, and I could be accused of electioneering promoting myself and getting coverage across a number of networks. I mean, it seems like a ridiculous thing, but I think we've all experienced less or more ridiculous things and been on the pointy end of them. So, to me, it seems subjective. The whole, yeah. It doesn't put you in an easy mind when next time you're out at an event and someone wants to get a photo with you, or you want to get a photo with a personality, and it's a sponsored event.
I don't think electioneering is an offence, but
under the guise of sponsorship, it could be, and we are going to come up into a hot time where there's all sorts of parameters around promotion and use of council equipment, and all sorts of things present themselves.
I mean, the question is the changes that are up on the screen. I think they cater for that, and Brendan had the great suggestion where, but I'm just trying to figure out if that's still in the word exclusive. Oh, the word explicit. Yeah, the intention is there that's we're not saying exclusive, but I think that might have already been removed. So the question, I suppose, is those changes Anne-Marie suggested, and Nick, does that deal with the issue? Yeah, Bill?
Yeah, I think Councillor Rebecca asked it before. What is explicit? It's rather subjective and it is open to interpretation. It depends on who's wielding the law and who's on the receiving end.
I just think whether we can vote on just removing it, that point. Both of them.
Could, Mr. Chair, could I have a follow-up, please?
Councillor Bill?
Could we defer this until if it's open to interpretation in this room, and we're talking about sums of money being involved here, which turns another level of scrutiny on everything, not just this room does, but how a sponsor behaves and fit for purpose and the guidelines of why we give sponsorship. I'm just wondering, should we just ask Bailey to have a rethink on this and come back to us? By no means, we need to be under scrutiny, that's for sure. That's part of the process. But when there's subjectivity, I just think there's a lot of man-hours, angst and anxiety and things that are wasted because we've had an ambiguous, some ambiguous wording in a policy, and that, think about staff trying to interpret this. Think about the uneasiness of a staff member observing a councillor acting inappropriately, and that interpretation of explicit is what, you know, it puts people in awkward situations potentially. I think if we can be clear about it. So I'm suggesting we defer.
Okay, well, I'll just ask the acting CEO if he can perhaps bring some light to finalisation of the matter other than deferring it.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Having listened to the room and trying to work out where we might be at, I wonder, councillors, if you would be comfortable with the deletion of the second bullet point, which talks about the explicit endorsement of the sponsor, so that that point gets removed. And then I thought we landed on the third line with an employee of council or councillor must not receive a benefit from a sponsor outside of the sponsorship agreement, and I thought there was general agreement around that. And my reading of the room is that they are the 2 points of contention, and I hope that those changes might address those points of concern and allow us to move forward.
Yes, Paul?
Suggesting removing both of them?
No, just the second one, which is sponsorship must not involve explicit endorsement of the sponsor or the sponsor's product. So remove that one.
So if someone's got an axe to grind with me, I'll go back to my example of I get a photo with a personality at a sponsored event, and someone could actually interpret that I'm receiving benefit, indirect benefit, by promoting myself with that identities network, or and I use the word electioneering for the want of a better, but you know, that's how it could be interpreted. Don't know. Maybe I'm drawing a long bow there, but yeah.
Councillor Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Chair. I hear Councillor Carl's concern about that. I think that, there's no wonder because you do this for long enough and you do become a little bit concerned. I think that, like, I'm personally comfortable with where that stands at the moment because I think that a receiving of benefit, the question would then be, what is that benefit? And it would be, I think there'd be a very strong case to be made that the example that you referred to, Councillor Carl, is unreasonable. So I think that I'm personally comfortable with where we've landed here, and if there's no further questions, I'd be happy to move it, Chair.
Okay, you want to raise a question? Yep.
Could we perhaps think of a word that describes the type of benefit? Because benefit can be perceived in lots. Is it a pecuniary benefit, or is it a financial benefit? Is it a, you know, I think if we're going to, I think I get what it implies, but let's be really ironclad about it. Let's not leave it open to interpretation. A financial benefit.
I think there were others who were going to second that motion. Is that correct? Or ask questions? Or question? Yeah. Okay, Councillor.
Thank you. And if we can work this out, I'd possibly second it. But I just wanted to go to page 165 on board books, where, and I know we've discussed this before, around the category and value. So we've got the small one up to 5,000, the general manager, and then 5,000 to 20,000, the CEO, and then 20,000 above that it comes to council. The reason why I'd like to see revert back to it being 10,000 and upward coming to council is there is opportunity if it. So two things. One, if it comes to council, there's opportunity for us to be able to promote that we're actually sponsoring a significant amount of money to a particular event. And then the second reason is recently there was one that was recommended for declining, and councillors went against the recommendation and it was it was a rally. Do you remember what that rally was? Not Endeavour, but something else. Right. Variety Bash. Thank you.
Variety.
Thanks, Eddie. The Variety Bash, if that hadn't come, we wouldn't have supported that. And so it worries me that we're allowing up to 20,000 to be decided by officers when the reason why we like to be involved in this decision making is to make sure that the social impact, which is what we always bring to the table, the social impact and community spirit that comes with some of these things. So I'd really like to see that go back to 5,000 to $9.99 be the CEO, and then 10,000 and above come to council for those two reasons. But of course, you know, I'll need support around a room for that change. And if we can get that support, then I'd be happy to second it.
Yeah. Sorry, there's a question. Was there a question there? No. Okay. Just to clarify in my mind, this is the approvals incoming sponsorship was the 9,999 to 10,000. Is that right? Whereas the outgoing is really what you're referring to, I think. And currently, the figures there are, as it is at the moment, 0 to 4,999, 5,000 to 14,999, 15 to 24,999. Is that right?
The medium one is 5,000 to 19,999, and then the large one is 20,000 and above.
Well, that's what's proposed, is the 20,000 and above on my screen. And the medium is what's proposed is 5 to 1999. 19,999.
Medium 5 to 999, and
That's
large
what's proposed.
10 to 10 and above. I just think that it's important that it actually comes to council for consideration because for two reasons. One, it can be promoted as something that we're sponsoring, which is always a good message. But also we pick up that social and community aspect that officers can't under their delegation because they're restricted to their particular guidelines. So it's no criticism of the officers, it's the criteria that they're limited to, whereas councillors can from a community and social.
Yeah, just to clarify, I think what's proposed is that in terms of the large one, that more will come to the council, because at present it doesn't come to council if it's under 24,999. What's proposed is that it comes to council if it's 20. So more will come to council with respect to the
not that we have
ones.
many anyway, but yeah, more would come.
Yeah.
Well, it would mean that they wouldn't slip through the cracks because of the limitation for officers with their criteria that they have to work under.
Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Chair. So, Councillor Summerfield, you're just proposing dropping the threshold of what comes to council from $19,999 to $9,999, with the reason being that anything $10,000 and above is a decision that could make a considerable difference to a community organisation or whatever, whoever is applying for a sponsorship, and that should be a council decision. I'm comfortable with that, Chair.
Well, it's the feeling of the room as agreeable to that. Okay, right, okay. Yep. Councillor O'Shea.
Yeah, just a question. Look, I understand and respect the position here where we're debating the number. I'm comfortable with the 20, and the reason being, I just want to check is, obviously the other issue with it those amounts coming to council, how much, from an officer point of view, does that slow down the process of the organisation receiving the money? Because it has to then go through that statutory process, meaning that, like, so if it's under officer delegation, I apply today, it can be approved under whatever that process is. But if it's under this at that particular amount, it needs to come to council, which means if it was in this case, it probably wouldn't get till next month, and they wouldn't get the money. Is that correct?
Yeah, I understand that was a major consideration, the expediency, which was raised as an issue through the consultation process, to making sure that those things are dealt with in a timely manner, and that was one of the considerations. So yeah, it will slow that down to get through the council meeting, into the council meeting process. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm comfortable with what the recommendation was personally.
Councillor Edwina?
Just reading this, with outgoing approvals from 5,000 to the 1999 is the CEO anyway, so it wouldn't bog down, I guess, the other teams. And I assume with the CEO, once he approves stuff or they're on his table, would he give us a heads up anyway? No. Okay. All right. Well, I'm still comfortable with the 20,000. I guess my other question is how many come through at that sort of price point?
Rough idea. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, councillors. I think without having the database in front of me, the trend has been for sponsorship requests that have come through have mainly been at the lower level, not a great deal at the higher. And that's partly, I guess, due to we're not actively out pursuing opportunities, and I would suggest is also linked to budget availability as well. One of the reasons, I suppose, that as Councillor Nancy mentioned, that we can be restricted is that we don't have the budget to be able to, positively assess or respond to a request. In most instances, or a large number of instances, it's actually the request that comes through could well and truly be supported through a community grant program, and we try and assist and direct those applicants in that way. The example used in the Variety Bash was always going to come to council because their original request, and would have still at this level as well, their original request was for $20,000 sponsorship. So while the recommendation in that report was to not support, it would have always come to council for consideration, and at that point, I guess, the decision was made to provide some level of support, which was a great outcome. The majority of requests received are minor, I would suggest, in nature. Okay. Sorry, does that answer the question? Was that?
Any further questions? Well, yeah. Your Deputy Mayor, your motion was, just to remind me.
I have to remind myself, Chair. I think it was the deletion of the explicit endorsement.
Yep.
And the insertion of the outside of the sponsorship agreement. And then the last point was the differences in those values. I hear Councillor O'Shea's point, and to be honest, I'm agnostic about it. But I'm happy to move this. If this fails, I'm happy to support the original recommendation as well. So I move this motion. Thank you.
Have you seconded to that? Okay. Second that?
I will second it, Chair, but could I also say that in there we need to also amend the sponsorship procedure documents to reflect the same? I think it's important that that happens as part of that process as well. And happy to second, thanks.
You're happy with that, to include that proviso?
Through you, Chair, that would just be appropriate governance, would it not? Yeah, thank you.
You happy with that? Okay. Any further discussion? Is it a question we go into debate or something like that? We have a mover and a seconder. Any further discussion? If not, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Favour? That's 6 in favour. Against? 6-3, so it's carried. Thank you. Yep. Okay. But just been brought to my attention that as Jeff didn't, as the Mayor didn't attend this part of the meeting, an apology needs to be recorded. So that's it, is it? Yeah, we've done that. Councillor Mel? Move that his apology be accepted. Second to that, if that's necessary. Councillor Megan, all those in favour, carried. Anything else? Well, that will now conclude the meeting. Thank you.
Welcome to the Economic Development Committee meeting for October 2023. The meeting will be live streamed, and thank all of those watching on Council social media channels. I acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse the lands we meet on today, the Western Wakwaka, Guyabal and Jarawar peoples, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We have we have a leave of absence. Councillor Carol Taylor has a leave of absence. We are recording Councillor McDonald, the Mayor, as an apology. We need a motion for that, Wendy? Yes. Can I have someone move? Councillor O'Shea, Councillor Melissa Taylor. All those in favour? It's carried. And there are no items. So that is the conclusion of the meeting. Thank you.